Lord's Day, and summer has officially arrived in Monterey Bay. It's like 50 degrees and foggy.
Well, here's the crazy thing. It's officially summer as of June 21st. That's the summer solstice. But if you're a Target shopper, you will have seen that all of the summer items have been clearanced out. There's just a little pile of things left. And now in place of all the summer stuff is school. Already, the end of June, all the school products are there. So I just feel like that's a little bit fast. Hello to Jessica coming in from YouTube. Good morning. Hello to the Wallaces from Facebook. Good morning, Tuan. Tuan, I'd love to know what you think about the summer hours of 9 o'clock. I know you usually go to work on Sunday morning, so I'm hoping that the 9 o'clock time frame will allow you to be on for the full time before you have to head out to work. So love to know your thoughts. Good morning, Jeremy. Good morning, Tina and John.
Yeah, welcome. It's a number of things are Lord willing, going to be evolving here when it comes to the ministry of Monarchs Church. But here for the summer, at least through the end of July, we are going to go to what I've referred to as summer hours here, where we start at 9 o'clock. And hopefully, in addition to being able to give you a little bit more time on your Sunday, it will also, because we do have individuals in other time zones.
Exactly, that's part of
hopefully it. Hopefully we'll accommodate their participation as well. And just seeing folks come in here, especially on Facebook. I see Bernie, I see Josie. Welcome, everybody.
And shout out to all of you who are watching outside of the social media platforms. We know you're there. We appreciate you being there. If you are watching on the social media platforms and we are not seeing your comments, we are not saying hello to you, it's because you have not given Ecamm permission. Ecamm is the software that we use to broadcast to both YouTube and Facebook at the same time, and your comments are pulled into our software. Mm-hmm. In order for us to see your comments, you would have to give Ecamm permission to pull those comments in. So if you haven't done that, there should be a little thing right there in your live stream that encourages you to give Ecamm permission. That's what that is. So if you're watching and you're on social media platforms and you want us to be able to interact with you, but we aren't, go ahead and give Ecamm permission. And just thank you to everyone being here this morning. Oh, Tuan starts at 10 today, so he gets to jump on for a little bit.
Well, the good news is you can take your phone with you, and then you and Walter and Dawn and all the gang there at Sticks.
That's right.
I'll give a shout out to everybody, and I'm sure even some of the clients and customers would love it.
I'm sure. Good morning to Dudley coming in from Tennessee. Good to see you here. So little by little, the family's coming in. Good morning, Susan. Welcome this morning. So we're going to have some fun today on both just the sermon you've prepared and then obviously a very significant ruling by the Supreme Court came down on Friday. And so I know people are probably wanting to talk about that, hear what we have to say about it. We're going to save that for the after party.
Yeah, we'll do that in the after party in part.
Well, you'd already prepared.
Well, not fully.
No, for your Sunday sermon. Yeah, it was already prepared, uploaded, notes, everything before the Friday ruling happened.
I do think that it's perfectly appropriate for churches to speak to major cultural events and so forth that have a moral component. If you recall back in 2020, for instance, with the George Floyd situation, murder, and consequences, we took multiple weeks
to brought guests on to discuss
speak about that. So it's perfectly fitting. And again, as I mentioned in prayer, there's probably a lot, at least today, that I'll leave unsaid simply because it's too large a topic to be able to sort of wave a magic wand and cure everything. But I will say that when it comes to this, I realize that if the church doesn't speak to the moral and social issues that the world around us is speaking to, we risk really being irrelevant.
Exactly.
And so I will share a few thoughts. I'm also going to make an appeal that I have confidence in. I'll just say that. And that is, good morning, Sarah Beth.
Hi, Sarah Beth.
My appeal is that the same maturity and wisdom and self-restraint that the Monarchs family demonstrated during, for instance, the 2020 election cycle, during the disputes over what proper COVID policy was, even perhaps the aftermath
vaccines,
the
all of
aftermath of George Floyd and so forth. There really, I think, was a lot of self-restraint that I consider to be the self-control. It's part of the fruit of the Spirit that was demonstrated on behalf of the
I've already
Monarchs
seen
family.
it demonstrated this weekend on behalf of the Monarchs family. Maybe somebody's put a post up about it. I think I follow most people that are connected with Monarchs, but I haven't seen anybody taking really vicious statements or being ugly. So thank you to the Monarchs family for just being self-controlled this weekend as well.
And obviously,
we all have opinions about it.
Obviously, I would desire that in the after party, and if it's something that needs a little bit more formal, like let's delve into the scripture about it and so forth, which it probably does. We can do that in another Sunday.
I was actually thinking, Jenna mentioned this to you, I think a week or so ago. We used to have what was called Secret Church.
Yes.
And this might actually be a great secret church to do. For those of you that are wondering what is secret church and why does it have to be secret, it came out of a book that David Platt wrote called Radical. And it was about an experience that he had in communist countries or closed countries?
He couldn't say what country, but it seemed like it would have been Vietnam.
Yeah, so they basically had to have church in secret. And all they could do was bring their Bibles and oftentimes just a flashlight. And for hours on end, they would just study the scripture.
7 to 10 hours a day.
Yeah. So we, years ago in our ministry, implemented Secret Church on a Friday night or on a Sunday night, and we would schedule it for 4 hours. And people are going, what? We would have a specific topic. One year you did it on Halloween, I believe, and it was
the 4 views of hell.
The 4 views of hell.
Yeah.
And we would take breaks for snacks and coffee, but we still had electricity and the lights on, but we didn't use the overhead projection. We didn't have any music. Mm-hmm. We kept it very just our Bibles and lighting, really, and we did record it and that sort of thing. So Jenna just asked recently about Secret Church and would we be doing that again? And we've been discussing Secret Church. So this might actually be a really good Secret Church topic.
And wouldn't that be a good one avenue of reincorporating in-person gatherings and so forth. So again, a lot of stuff on the table.
Well, and if we did it in person, we could also still have a tune-in
for those out of the
option
area.
For those that don't live in the area and want to participate. So I don't know. There's something I was just thinking about this morning that I thought, we have so much to discuss on the topic that it might really be a great Secret Church one.
That having been said, because for me personally, I have a number of friends and even some relatives that fall everywhere on the spectrum in terms of the view. And so when it comes to this, I think it's probably normal to have very passionate opinions and views and so forth. But at the same time, I've noticed a lot of individuals have gotten rather ugly. No matter what side they fall on, whether it was sort of spiking the football, or whether it was, really advocating for some real ugliness and so forth. And so, again, we're back to the question, what does love require of me?
Exactly.
We are held to a different standard. We are called to transcend this world. And so it doesn't mean that we're immune from it. And certainly in our free society, we actually get to contribute. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't take advantage of that, whether it be our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote, and so forth. But it is something that, first and foremost, we are representatives of and subjects to the King of Kings. So,
and this is an issue that, while very serious, very important, people hold very passionately. I cannot think of any reason why people should not lose friendships over it, that they should lose relationship. So I think that's something to keep in mind too, as we discussed. There are probably going to be people in the Monarchs family that have difference of opinion, that will maybe dramatically, maybe a little bit, but let's keep that in mind when we're discussing it, that this is, I think we have to be careful to just, like you teach a message about not cutting off the limbs of a fruit tree. That
cutting
can later,
them down altogether.
Cutting a fruit tree down altogether that could later be of nourishment or benefit to you. So I think we keep that in mind too, the value of relationship with one another.
Well, and it's like I told our girls the other day, you're talking about in many cases individuals all over the place. A lot of people don't like to think. Okay,
yes,
so it's just
true.
It's just a matter of whatever, regurgitate this, that, or the other. So in many cases, it's hard to get too bashy towards somebody else when you realize there literally is an element of ignorance that you have to be able to deal with. So anyway, we'll get it.
Cynthia coming in from YouTube. Good to see you.
We'll get into the after party there a little bit. So
everybody's like, "Can you hurry through your sermon, Pastor?"
No, because somebody might say, wow, this is like a major deal in American history, and certainly the church. Big C church, global church, or at least church in America, seems to have played various roles in it, or Christians and so forth. Aren't you going to focus on that? Well, no, I'm going to focus on teaching the Word of God.
And some people might be tuning in this morning on the other hand and saying, I'm so tired of hearing about it this weekend. Mm-hmm. Pastor, can we talk about something else?
Absolutely.
So we're going to talk about it in the after party. If you've had your fill, you can tune out at the after party. But I don't think you'll want to. I think it'll be a great discussion. So, are you ready to go into trivia?
I am. There's only 3 questions I have today, and then I'm going to show you a video. And the reason for that video is it's going to set the stage for what I want to talk about. And interestingly enough, despite, or maybe even it's a good thing in terms of this message coinciding with the decision this week, but we have been talking about really the need to, while the culture around us may vex our souls and so forth, we really have to look inward and say, God, help me not to, violate your principles. Help me to live right for you. And so really, I wanted to spend today, and this was a message I had already cultivated prior to the ruling on Friday, and that is addressing the reality of church leaders that sin, because that's another big issue in our society. And I think in many cases, because of it, you have the prophetic voice of the church that is called to really speak to, the culture, not like John the Baptist did to Herod. It gets undermined when you have just the blatant hypocrisy and sin that happens. And so there is a need for us to sort of police ourselves. And so before we get too hot and bothered about the world around us, we hearken to the New Testament, where the apostles were first and foremost concerned about purity within the church.
Right.
So that's what we're going to look at.
Yeah. So we're still part of the overall series that you've been teaching, but you kind of hit pause before we go into some of the creeds of the culture around us. We need to look inward in the mirror. So this is still part of the mirror portion of the series. Good morning to Kathleen. So this is your time to interact with us. We're getting ready to put questions up. So it's some trivia. So get ready to interact.
I'm going to ask 3 questions. And again, like I said, it's going to tie into what I want to teach. I'm going to play a video, and then I'm going to ask 2 more questions, and then we'll jump into the Word of God. So
okay, are you ready? So what year was the first federal population census taken in America? First census.
Yeah, so we had one in 2020. It came out that we have 331 million and change in
1790, 1820, 1870, or 1900. Now, these are done every, 10 years?
10
years. That correct?
Every 10 years.
Every 10 years. So when did it first begin?
So yeah, we have, according to 2020, we had like 331 million and change in America. Obviously the highest population we've ever had. But this is something that I don't know whether individuals realize it or not, but when it started, when did it start where a census was being taken to number of
Kathleen coming in
souls
right away
in America. Yeah.
With the correct answer, 1790.
It was way back.
Yeah, I'm actually surprised by that it was that far back that we began to count the population.
And if I'm not mistaken, there were between 3 and 4 million people in America. So basically 2.5 million people less than the Bay Area has right now.
And so now if that's the case, we're talking 100 times more now? If you said 100 times more now?
Yeah. Dudley's got it. Yep, 1790. That was it. Interesting. It's just interesting to me.
Yeah. Okay, another question. In which year did the federal census first record over 10 million people in America? 1, 1800, 2, 1810, 3, 1820, or 4, 1830? So in 1790, when they started counting, you said it was about 4 million?
Yeah, a little less than, I think.
A little less than 4 million? So when did it first record over 10 million people in America?
Did it mushroom in 10 years? Did it take 20, 30, 40? What do you think?
I wonder how many people that very first time actually did it. You know how people can be wary of things? Were they really all accounted for? Or were they just like so small that they trusted that? Yeah, it was probably small enough, I would imagine they trusted. Unless there were some like Tories that were worried they were going to get, sent to Canada or something. I always wonder I'm sure not everybody takes the census.
Jenna coming in at 1820, good guess, but incorrect.
That's incorrect.
Now you have a 3 out of 4 chance of getting it right. When did America cross the 10 million people threshold? Kathleen coming in with A, 1800, another good guess, but wrong. So now you got a 50-50 chance.
That's right, 50-50.
10 million people today is approximately the population of Los Angeles County.
That's crazy.
So basically, Los Angeles County, when did we get that number in America?
Yeah.
And I'm not seeing it, so let's give it to him.
Oh, Dudley's
rolling. It was 1830.
I know Dudley watches on YouTube, so I'm wondering if he's. I know he was maybe a minute, so he might need to scroll over to the live to make sure he's current, because his answers are coming in a little bit delayed. So
but
I'm wondering if
still correct.
He's correct. That's right.
Okay.
1830.
Last one.
Okay.
Last one.
So in 1860, according to the last census taken before the Civil War, what was the U.S. population? A, 31.4 million, B, 38.5 million, C, 50.2 million, or D, 63 million.
So basically,
before the Civil War.
Yeah, Civil War, which obviously was the bloodiest conflict in American history, lost 600,000 soldiers. So what was the population going into it? Interestingly enough, the census from 1870, so 10 years later, including the deadliest decade in American history at that point, the population did go up, pretty significantly, by millions. So even with all those deaths of basically childbearing male age, just wiped off the face of the earth, the population in America still increased significantly in that decade. So what do we got here? We got Sam coming in at 63.
So far, nobody's got the correct
Jen,
answer.
I think, meant 63 as well. Jeremy is correct.
Jeremy's got the correct answer, 31.4 million. It's interesting how quickly it was populating. Mm-hmm. There was probably, immigration, and then you also are obviously having births as well.
Right, and again, 600,000 roughly soldiers on both sides, all Americans, perished in that conflict. And so you think about that, 600,000 out of 31 million is pretty significant number. Yeah. And again, this is not something that's even disputed. I mean, whether you look at pro-choice websites or pro-life websites and so forth, it's just a matter of statistics. So this is not a statement regarding the morality of abortion. Like I said, we'll carry that in the after party. However, I believe since Roe versus Wade was ruled in 1973, the number of abortions in America was around 62 million. So you're talking about twice as many people, or twice as many abortions, I should say, as there were people in 1860, right before the war started. So interesting number.
Yeah, Dudley, I knew you listened on YouTube, which is why I thought your answers are so delayed. I'm wondering if YouTube doesn't automatically bring you up to the live portion. So I think there's Jessica or Jeremy might have the instructions on how to make sure you're watching live. You might be, and it just might be a delay. But It seems a little bit more so than
So
usual.
you might say, what's the deal with the census? Why are you talking about the census? Well, because I want to talk about the book of Numbers for a second, okay? The reason why it's called the book of Numbers is because of the census that God commanded that they take at the beginning. And so it's going to tie in a little bit to what I want to talk about regarding, church leaders that sin and how we sort of process that. Because what we see in the New Testament sort of borrows pretty heavily from the Old Testament, particularly the book of Numbers, where we're going to go today. So I just want to show you a Bible Project video of the book of Numbers. It's about 5 minutes, so hang with us. Good morning, Jaden.
Jaden. Here we go, Book of Numbers.
The Book of Numbers gets overlooked, partly because it has a really boring name.
Which is a shame. In the Hebrew tradition, the book's name is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. And it's an epic travelogue about Israel's journey through the desert on their way to the land promised to Abraham.
Now, this pilgrimage should only take about 2 weeks on foot.
But instead, it takes them about 40 years.
That's crazy. It's practically half of someone's lifetime.
Yeah, it's a very long camping trip with lots of interesting stories, but let's remember it's most helpful to back up and start with how this book is designed.
Right.
So the book is broken up into 5 sections. There are 3 wilderness locations, broken up by 2 road trips that link all the pieces together.
The first wilderness section is Mount Sinai, right here on the map.
And then in the second section, they travel to a region called Paran.
A whole bunch of things happen here in the wilderness of Paran.
And then in this 4th section is Israel's road trip to Moab.
The book ends with a large section in the wilderness of Moab, right across the Jordan River from the Promised Land.
Now, through all of these sections, the storyline just flows like a gripping dramatic movie. Everything starts great, but then the trip goes horribly wrong, and it all ends with the final redemptive moment, the surprising act of God's grace.
So let's jump into the story. It all begins at the wilderness at Mount Sinai, and we've become really familiar with this mountain.
Yeah, if you remember, Israel came here after Egypt, and they formed a covenant with God here, got the 10 Commandments here, built the tabernacle here, and they've been at this mountain for 1 full year.
And now they take a census to number the people as they prepare to leave.
Right, and they're given these instructions for how to organize all those people in the camp. God's presence in the tabernacle, and then the tribe of Levi and the priests around it, and then the rest of the tribes around them. And this pattern, it's this visual symbol for how God's holiness is at the center of their existence as a people.
And they're told that when the cloud of God's presence moves, they're to pack up and travel with it.
Yeah, the Ark of the Covenant is carried by the Levites out in front, and then the tribe of Judah, and on and on. And this order is also a symbol for how God's holy presence is their leader and guide through the wilderness.
We begin the second section of the book with enthusiasm as they leave Mount Sinai and travel up to Paran. God's with them, everything's organized. This is going to be great.
But it's not great. After just 3 days on the road, the people are complaining about their hunger and thirst, and then even Moses' brother and sister start bad-mouthing him in front of all the people.
Not a great start. But now we're into the third section, the wilderness of Paran. This is where they send the 12 spies to scout out the Promised Land. 2 of those spies come back, and they're really optimistic.
But the other 10 are freaked out, and they don't trust God, and they go around saying, we're going to get annihilated in there. And so they start a mutiny, and they try to appoint a new leader who's going to take all the people back to Egypt. And so basically, they are refusing to go into the Promised Land, and God honors their choice. He says that this generation is going to wander for 40 years and die in the wilderness, and only their kids will get to enter the Promised Land.
You know, this story here gets brought up many times in the Bible by different authors.
Yeah, and it always serves as a reminder that while God remains faithful to his people and his promises, he will honor their choices. He'll let them waste their whole lives if they choose to live in rebellion.
Okay, so the trip's been a disaster so far.
And it gets worse here in this 4th section as they're traveling to Moab. Even Moses has a moment of rebellion and is disqualified from entering the Promised Land. Then there's another rebellion among the people that results in this snake attack. And what makes all these rebellions even worse is that every step of the way, God has been providing. He's been offering forgiveness. He's been giving them food and water and this crazy stuff called manna.
Yeah, what is that stuff?
Yeah, no idea. But in spite of all this, they keep complaining, and they say that they wish they had died in slavery in Egypt.
If I was God, I would just give up on these guys.
You would think. But that's what makes this story in the final section so surprising. Israel has just arrived in Moab, and the king of Moab, he's freaked out that this huge group of people is traveling through his land. So he hires this pagan sorcerer named Balaam to pronounce curses on them.
This guy means business.
Yeah, and so Balaam, he says, okay, I'm going to pray to the Hebrew God, and let's see what happens. And 3 different times he attempts to curse them, but each time he finds that he can utter only blessing. Most surprising is the last blessing, where he prophesies that out of Israel will rise a victorious king. And this king is somehow going to be connected to God's promise to Abraham to bless all nations through this family. So here's Israel rebelling down in the camp, totally unaware that up in the hills, God is protecting and even blessing them.
The book ends here in Moab. Israel's getting ready to go into the promised land. They count up everyone again, just like at the beginning. They're leaving the old generation behind, including Moses.
But before they leave Moses, he gives them his last words of warning and wisdom. And that speech is what the next book, Deuteronomy, is all about.
That's the Bible Project.
Yeah, well, here's the deal.
Good stuff right there.
Yeah, for a 5-minute overview, that's pretty good.
Yeah, very good. Hello to the humbles.
And hello, Cynthia, no apologies. We understand. So, here's a question. I have 2 questions sort of following up from the book of Numbers. And the first is, again, if you are familiar with the book of Numbers, if you're not, then, it's a cool book. I encourage you to read it. But if you are familiar with it, what notable problem regarding Balaam and Israel did the video unfortunately leave out? Now, I realize that it's not articulated in the book of Numbers, so that's probably why they did. But if you take systematic theology about Balaam, you're going to know what that notable problem was.
But the Bible Project gives the overview of each book.
Right.
They don't always tie to another book because they're doing an overview of that particular one.
So when it comes to Balaam, and of course, yes, he blesses them when he was hired to curse them, simply because God wouldn't let him curse them. But he was able to do something, to sort of earn his money. Anybody remember what that is?
Give him some time to answer. There was a theophany that stopped him in the middle of the road.
Okay, well, yeah, but I'm talking about even after that. Because remember, even with that, he decided to press on ahead. Because even God was like, look, if you really want to disobey me, I'll let you. Okay? And I will still turn your curse into a blessing, and I will still then, have to judge you for your disobedience, Balaam. Right. And that happened as well. So that's good. That's not what I'm talking about, though. But yes, it did leave that out, too. And again, obviously, it's not going to go verse by verse and take 5 minutes. So, the
well, one of the notable parts, I don't know that it was a problem, but the notable was when his donkey spoke to him.
Well, that's what he's talking about.
Did he kill someone?
Well, I'll tell you what.
Just because the only one.
Go to the next question. Go to the next question.
Okay, you're not answering this one then?
No, I will. I'll come to it.
If you are familiar with the events recorded in the book of Numbers, which one stands out most to you and why? So the 10 spies and their discouragement, the bronze snake, Korah's rebellion, Moses' punishment for striking the rock twice, Miriam's curse, Israel complaining in the wilderness, Aaron's rod that miraculously budded, etc. That's Jenna responding.
Yeah, again, if you are familiar with the book of Numbers.
A lot happened in the book of Numbers besides counting them.
Yes, a lot took place. I know for me, the story, the chapter leading up to Korah's rebellion, and then Korah and Dathan and Abiram, which again, I realize I'm a word nerd, so you might say, I don't even know what you're talking about, but it is fascinating. It is just a fascinating study, including of just human nature, when you look at what occurred in these chapters.
Yeah.
And so, for me, I would say it was probably, and it's called Korah's rebellion, but really it was not just Korah. It was Dathan and Abiram and a number of the priests and so forth. And it was fascinating. Anyway,
well, there's a lot. I mean, I'm kind of with Jeremy on the 10 spies. I think there's such a powerful lesson in that, and their just negativity and just despair of it, like the impossible, versus the 2 that came back was just so much like, hey, we can do anything. We can do it with God.
Miriam and Aaron, complaining about Moses publicly because he married an Ethiopian. You
Yeah.
know, basically, sort of a race-based, nastiness on the part of his own brother and sister. And God said, you know what? I don't accept that. Moses is my friend. I talked to him face to face.
Yeah.
So, and Miriam ends up getting smitten with leprosy for a week as a punishment. And it's like God saying, you know what? If her dad had spit in her face, she would be unclean for a week. So that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, so that was a fascinating story, particularly for those that would have, unfortunately, in American history, for instance, use the Bible as an excuse for racism. When you have Moses himself, God defending him for his interracial marriage.
Right.
But again,
Jessica, and I'm not, this might be Jenna, the fact that God allowed the Israelites to be blessed by Balaam while they sinned and rebelled. Also the fact that God let Israel have free will and not let them enter the promised land. Dudley saying, wandering in the wilderness. I've spent time there as well. I think we all have. Kathleen, I'm struck by the two spies. Sam coming in.
yeah, being able to
Korah.
stand up to the
Oh, absolutely.
the chorus of negativity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So good stuff. The notable problem regarding Balaam and Israel that the video left out is what I'm going to talk a little bit about today. And that is that he couldn't curse them. So instead, he was able to teach how to corrupt them. Because if you can't defeat God's people, then you have to sort of corrupt them so God will defeat them.
This is straight out of like Screw Tape Letters.
Yes.
C.S. Lewis.
And so that's sort of what Balaam did. He would pay the price for that. Let me just have you read 1 Corinthians 11, 1 through 13.
I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors.
Actually, this is 1 Corinthians 10. That's a mistake on my part. So for those of you who want to read this in your own Bible, it's actually 1 Corinthians 10.
Okay, well, we can fix that on the fly here. I don't want you to forget, dear brothers and sisters, about our ancestors in the wilderness long ago. All of them were guided by a cloud that moved ahead of them, and all of them walked through the sea on dry ground. In the cloud and in the sea, all of them were baptized as followers of Moses. All of them ate the same spiritual food,
Manna.
and all of them drank the same spiritual water.
It came from the rock.
For they drank from the spiritual rock that traveled with them, and that rock was Christ. Yet God was not pleased with most of them, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. These things happened as a warning to us, so that we would not crave evil things as they did, or worship idols as some of them did. As the scriptures say, the people celebrated with feasting and drinking, and they indulged in pagan revelry. And we must not engage in sexual immorality as some of them did, causing 23,000 of them to die in one day. Nor should we put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and then died from snake bites. And don't grumble, as some of them did, and then were destroyed by the angel of death. These things happened to them as examples for us. They were written down to warn us who live at the end of the age. If you think you are standing strong, be careful not to fall. The temptations in your life, my eyes are having trouble today. In your life are no different from what others experience, and God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, he will show you a way out so that you can endure.
Okay, so when it comes to the book of Numbers, we see that Paul himself, in writing to the church at Corinth, says, hey guys, don't just, chuck the Old Testament and think that there's nothing for you today just because you're in the New Covenant, grace versus law. But remember that these individuals and their dealings with one another, with God, with leadership, including sinning leadership like Aaron, Miriam, even Moses, those are all things that were written for examples and for our benefit. And so I want us to take note of that, because even Jesus is going to make reference to Balaam. So, without further ado, we're going to jump into the sort of preaching part here. And there's only 2 sections that we're going to cover, and they're a total of 15 minutes. So
So when you say 15 minutes, for those of you who might be new here or watching on the archive and you've never watched at Monarchs before, when we go to Pergamum and Pete, you're going to see a clock drop down in the lower right corner of your screen, and Max only has a certain amount of time for each one of these topics, and then it will automatically go to the next one. Mm-hmm. And so you're ready for that clock to start?
Let's do it.
Okay, here we go.
Pergamum and Pete being the Apostle Peter.
Right.
But let's start with Pergamum, first with a question. And the question is, we talk about what does love require of me? Well, this is more of a rhetorical question, but does love require of me that I tolerate or condone sins that God, according to his word, doesn't?
This is a great question.
Okay. Does love require that I tolerate or condone sins that God doesn't? Now you might say, well, that's obvious. Of course not. Yet I would submit to you that in many cases, we feel like love requires us to, I don't know what you want to call it, tolerate, condone, sweep under the rug, coddle, permit, tolerate certain sins that God, according to his word, just simply doesn't.
Right.
And what we just saw from 1 Corinthians 10, where the Apostle Paul is, let me give you a laundry list of where Israel blew it so that you don't do likewise.
Right.
Okay? So, again, it's a rhetorical question. What does love require of me? Well, a lot of things, but what it doesn't require of me is to tolerate and condone sins that God doesn't.
Right.
Because otherwise, I'm actually putting myself above God.
Yeah.
Okay? So, let's take a look at Revelation 2.
Write this letter to the angel of the church in Pergamum. This is the message from the one with the sharp two-edged sword. I, Jesus, know that you live in the city where Satan has his throne.
It's a tough place to have church.
Yeah, no kidding. Yet you have remained loyal to me. You refused to deny me even when Antipas, my faithful witness, was martyred among you there in Satan's city.
Good stuff.
But I have a few complaints against you. You tolerate some among you whose teaching is like that of Balaam, who showed Balak how to trip up the people of Israel. He taught them to sin by eating food offered to idols and by committing sexual sin.
So Jesus is referring to the account that is in the Old Testament book of Numbers, chapters 22 through 25, if you want to read them.
In a similar way, you have some Nicolaitans among you who follow the same teaching. Repent of your sin, or I will come to you suddenly and fight against them with the sword of my mouth.
So what we see from Pergamum here is that neither our loyalty to Christ nor our being faithful witnesses gives us license to condone or worse, celebrate sins that are hated by Christ. Okay, there's no salvation without a holy life change for anybody. Okay, all of us, we all get to participate in that holy life change. Individuals who say, well, I believe in God. Great. James said even the demons believe and tremble. That just, that's a pretty low bar, okay? Yeah. So when it comes to salvation, there has to be holy life change where we align ourselves with the will of God and with the character of Christ. And so Jesus is commending them for what they're doing right, but he's saying, hey guys, that doesn't give you a license to condone or celebrate the sins that I hate. So the church in Pergamum, okay, it's a city in modern-day Turkey, Roman province of Asia Minor, was largely loyal to Jesus. This church, and this is a tough city. It's where Satan's throne was, according to Jesus. But they tolerated what he deemed intolerable. Okay, and it was those who embraced Balaam's doctrine, and of course the Nicolaitans did as well, among God's people. Now, what did Balaam teach? Because he's making a genuine reference. There wasn't some dude in the church in Pergamum named Balaam.
Right.
He's referring back to Numbers and this animating force of what he did and how he corrupted God's people. And so in the New Testament, he's saying basically this Balaam's doctrine has gotten into your church. And so the first was participation in paganism. And too many times we see Christianity with this syncretistic mess of taking pagan elements with Christian elements. And again, sometimes it's just errant beliefs. Other times it's a promotion of things that are just flat out idolatrous. The other thing was sexual sinning. This was one of the main ways that Balaam was able to get Israel tripped up. And then, of course, Balaam was known for money over mission. He heard from God, but he was more concerned about money than doing the will of God. So I ask God forgive your church, not just Pergamum, but today, wherever these three things have sort of oozed in, or we have tolerated them. Forgive us and free us from these sins. Now, what about Pete? Let's take a look at 2 Peter.
But there were also false prophets in Israel, just as there will be false teachers among you. They will cleverly teach destructive heresies and even deny the master who bought them.
Now, folks, I wish this weren't the case, but there will always be church leaders who sin, who fail, who do wrong.
Yes.
that is never Jesus' fault, and it is never an excuse for us to unhitch from him.
That's right. In this way, they will bring sudden destruction on themselves. Many will follow their evil teaching and shameful immorality. And because of these teachers, the way of truth will be slandered.
That's sad right there. That happens.
In their greed, they will make up clever lies to get hold of your money. But God condemned them long ago, and their destruction will not be delayed.
So, to avoid serious disillusionment and crises of faith, we must remember that the churches of Jesus have always been plagued with various problems, including sinful church leaders, ever since the first century. Okay, yet God will always prevail, and He knows those who belong to Him. He will always have a people. But unfortunately, this reality, we know from Peter, it does make the name of Jesus look bad to the world. So continuing with 2 Peter 2.
These false teachers are like unthinking animals, creatures of instinct, born to be caught and destroyed. They scoff at things they do not understand, and like animals, they will be destroyed. Their destruction is their reward for the harm they have done.
Peter wasn't a member of PETA.
No, he wasn't. They love to indulge in evil pleasures in broad daylight. They are a disgrace and a stain among you.
Pretty hardcore.
Very hardcore. They delight in deception, even as they eat with you in your fellowship meals.
So these are people in the church that call themselves Christians and leaders.
They commit adultery with their eyes, and their desire for sin is never satisfied. They lure unstable people into sin, and they are well trained in greed. They live under God's curse. They have wandered off the right road and followed the footsteps of Balaam, son of Beor, who loved to earn money by doing wrong.
So the Lord does not excuse.
This is hardcore.
Yeah, I mean, Peter preaches in ways that most Americans really wouldn't let him pastor us, to be honest.
Right.
The Lord doesn't excuse serious sins among His followers, nor does He accept that the sins of Christians should ever be used as an excuse to abandon Him.
Yes.
Jesus always transcends the wrongdoings of His followers, including the wrongdoings of those who are leaders in the church. Psalm 106 takes us back a little bit to Balaam. Briefly,
they yoked themselves,
Israel, due to Balaam's teaching,
to the Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices offered to lifeless gods. They aroused the Lord's anger by their wicked deeds, and a plague broke out among them. But Phinehas
was the grandson of Aaron, the high priest, who Aaron was Moses' brother.
But Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was checked. This was credited to him as righteousness for endless generations to come.
Now, keep this up here for a second. Anybody know how Phinehas intervened?
Oh, he murdered. I shouldn't say
he executed.
Yeah, he killed someone.
There was an Israelite leader who brought in the daughter of a Midianite leader in the front of the whole congregation, went into the tent and started committing fornication, sexual sin with her. Phinehas was like, enough is enough, gets up with a javelin and takes them
in the middle of their passion,
makes a shish kebab out of both of them.
Yeah.
And God says, way to go, Phinehas. I mean, obviously he's not advocating for violence in the new covenant, but there is something about intervening when sin is going on that this is, I mean, Peter's doing it. We see this in Revelation. So here's a question that I'll sort of close up with.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever felt as though you might be more loving and merciful toward those in sin than God would be?
Oh.
It goes back to that first question about what love requires and what it doesn't.
You know what? I think sometimes the way you can identify this is when you see other leaders taking what you think is too hard of a stand. Chances are you're actually being more loving and merciful than God would.
Well, and maybe they are. Okay, maybe they are being too hard. Maybe they are being ridiculous. But again, what we have to guard against is somehow, and that's why knowing the Bible is so important, because it's like there are times in which I think if we're not careful, we will all be tempted to fancy ourselves as though somehow we're more loving and merciful than the God of the Bible. That's impossible. That's idolatry.
Jeremy said no pulling punches here.
Correct. So Dio is not Ronnie James. It's Diotrephes. Okay, and we learn about Diotrephes in 3 John. Verses 9 through 11.
I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have the preeminence among them, does not receive us. Therefore, if I come, I will call to mind his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words, and not content with that, he himself does not receive the brethren, and forbids those who wish to, putting them out of the church. Beloved, do not imitate what is evil, but what is good.
So, when it comes to Diotrephes, and thank you, Jessica, Dudley, as far as more empathy than God tolerates, again, I don't know. We can, maybe carry that to the after party, because I do think that, having empathy is actually the character of God.
I think he's just acknowledging what you said. Like, he may have found himself at times doing that.
So the arrogance of Diotrephes, when we're talking about, the unfortunate reality of church leaders in sin, you have an abusive church leader who loves status control and preeminence. And again, this was in the first century. It's in the 21st century. And we have to realize, okay, when this happens, we don't excuse it. The Bible doesn't excuse it. But we have to deal with it. The arrogance of Diotrephes, again, we have an arrogant church leader who expressed open malice towards Christ's beloved and directly appointed Apostle John. That's pretty bad when you're going to basically blackball the Apostle John.
These are the peoples that have the pastor for lunch.
Oh my word!
They have the preacher.
Well,
for
he
lunch.
was a church leader.
Yeah.
In this case, having the apostle for lunch.
Yeah.
2 Timothy 4. Let's take a look at Demas.
Make every effort to come to me soon, for Demas deserted me, since he loved the present age, and he went to Thessalonica.
So the lusts of Demas. Okay. This is a morally compromised church leader who loved the temporal enticements of the world around him more than his mission to proclaim eternal life to the world around him. And that's a tragedy. All of us have seen that. That makes the news, okay? It makes the news here recently, including some, very high-profile churches they've made documentaries about.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to this, whereas a church leader like Diotrephes abuses his authority, because an abuse of spiritual authority is a sin, and it's rooted in pride, okay, out of arrogance. A church leader like Demas abandons his authority out of worldliness and basically leaves the sheep untended in that regard. So Diotrephes and Demas illustrate two of the big temptations really for church leaders and for those who follow them. One is an arrogantly harsh abusiveness. And unfortunately, we've seen it. There are many people who've been victimized by it. And thanks to the wonderful world of the internet, they usually congregate and spread it. And again, I have compassion for them. I don't think that's the right way to handle it. And then we also have the reality of morally compromised worldliness. And that, too, is something that is... that's something that non-Christians are happy to point out to us. And you know what? They're not wrong. Okay, so when it comes to this, we have to watch ourselves. We have to watch even those we follow, particularly when it comes to celebrity Christianity, which, again, I'll talk about that in another context. 1 John 2.
Do not love this world, nor the things it offers you. For when you love the world, you do not have the love of the Father in you. For the world offers only a craving for physical pleasure.
Sexual lust, gluttony, intoxication.
A craving for everything we see.
Greed, envy, coveting.
And pride in our achievements and possessions.
Vanity, pride, abusiveness, arrogance.
These are not from the Father, but are from this world. And this world is fading away, along with everything that people crave, but anyone who does what pleases God will live forever.
So Demas obviously was a big problem here, but so was Diotrephes when it comes to this. So there can be no greater model of uncompromising truth and holiness combined with effectively attractive loving kindness than Jesus himself. And guess what? They still murdered him. So here's the deal. We won't get murdered for attractive loving kindness. We will get murdered for uncompromising truth and holiness.
Right.
Okay?
Right.
That's the reality, and that's what happened to Jesus. He is our model. He is our example, even when church leaders like Diotrephes, Demas, those in Pergamum failed.
Right.
So, final thoughts here on the lesson of Jesus versus Diotrephes and Demas, and that's this. Better to be hated for being like Christ than to be hated or loved for not being like him. So, when it comes to this, it's one thing if the world hates us because we're obnoxious or because we're too much like them. It's something altogether different if we're hated because we're at least endeavoring to be as close like Jesus as possible.
Well, I was thinking too, when you're talking about just that spirit of Balaam who does what he can to trip up the people of God. If we're not careful, we will allow the spirit of Diotrephes and Demas to trip us up because we're looking to leaders and we have a higher standard, and rightfully so, because the standard is Jesus. And when they don't measure up to Jesus, we just throw everything out. We allow our own walk with the Lord to be completely tripped up and say, well, this must not be true. This is where you get into people saying, I love God, but I hate his church. And it's all very understandable when you've had these examples
on
of
an
Demas
emotional level.
or Diotrephes. But you also have to realize behind that is also the spirit of Balaam, which purpose is to trip you up so that you end up losing out personally with God. And that's where we have to be on guard. We have to be watchful.
I mean, you think about Peter, the one who wrote what he did, again, pulling no punches, as Jeremy said, and yet Peter sinned horrifically.
Yeah.
He denied Jesus 3 times. I mean, just flat out lied in a way that most of us have probably never done.
Yeah.
Likewise, Moses and Aaron, I mean, they sinned as well. There's something that is not invalidating just because a church leader sins. However,
it's disappointing.
It's disappointing. It's disillusioning.
Yeah.
But you also have to see what is their response, what is their reaction. And again, if God accepts their repentance and restores them accordingly, like he did with Aaron, like he did with Peter, so forth, then we have to be careful not to allow our grudges to go beyond God's grace.
Right.
So,
well, and in some cases, there isn't even a restoration of that leadership and maybe a covering up, a sweeping under the rug kind of thing. And that's where you've got to really, make sure that your own walk with the Lord and your heart is right with God. And maybe that means you have to find a new place to go to church or whatever. But what I see too often is people get so disillusioned and disappointed. They just say, none of this must be real. And they throw it all out.
And in all fairness, part of it is because we disregard the scripture. Because in 1 Timothy 5, I don't have it on here, it talks about the church leaders who sin.
Yeah.
And the response was from Paul, the apostle, to Timothy, the bishop over the region there in Ephesus. He said, look, you've got local pastors there that are serving under you. Of course, that's where American church differs from the early church.
Yeah.
But he said, you need to take those church leaders who are sinning and you need to publicly reprimand and rebuke them, so that the others realize the seriousness of sin,
right?
And won't follow in their footsteps. Now, some of them may have sinned in a way that disqualified them from ministry. Others maybe not. But the fact is that we don't do that. For the most part, American churches don't do that.
Right.
The closest example you can get are what I would call the well-meaning YouTube assassins who go on and they, will take shots at everybody.
But they don't really have the authority to discipline, which is why then it just becomes another mess.
Correct. And so when it comes to this, let me show you Daniel here as sort of a model for prayer, because Daniel was a holy man. He was a prophet. But he realized, what? God's people, they're a bit compromised here. And so we need to pray. And so in Daniel chapter 9, we see, he said, so I, Daniel, turned to the Lord and pleaded with him in prayer and fasting. I also wore rough burlap and sprinkled myself with ashes, and I prayed to the Lord my God and confessed, O Lord, you are great and awesome God. You always fulfill your covenant and keep your promises of unfailing love to those who love you and obey your commands. But we have sinned and done wrong. We have rebelled against you and scorned your commands and regulations. Now notice, when Daniel does this, a couple things. The first place he focuses is not on their failures, but on God's faithfulness.
Yes.
God, I'm appealing to you because you are faithful, because you keep a covenant, that regardless of what we may do, we know that your love does not fail.
Right.
Now, I have to confess, notice, he doesn't say, hey, these idiot Israelites over here have really messed up, but I'm a holy man. So no, he says, look, we have all blown it. Okay. Yeah. We've rebelled. We've scorned your commands and regulations. So there is an element where we have to even be willing to confess, maybe I'm not sinning quite like the dude who made the news, okay? Maybe I'm not sinning quite like the individual that really, really made a mess of things and people got crossed up because of it. But I got to own my own part in it. And whether I like it or not, if I'm part of the family of God, then we're all in this together. He goes on in verse 9. He says, but the Lord our God is merciful and forgiving, even though we have rebelled against him. We've not obeyed the Lord our God, and we've not followed the instructions he gave us through his servants, the prophets. So again, he continues to focus on the mercy and the forgiveness of God without covering up where, he says we have rebelled against you, where we have not obeyed you, where we have not followed you. And again, I think it's appropriate for us to be able to admit, you know what, God, even as your people, whether it's in front of coworkers, family, friends, neighbors, other Christians, our children, our grandchildren, we've messed up.
Yeah.
But we know you are merciful, and we know you are forgiving. And if we come and confess and forsake, we have confidence that the blood of Christ will cleanse us. So he goes on and he says this, all the neighboring nations mock. Why? Because we've not represented you well.
Right.
They mock your people because of our sins and the sins of our ancestors. That's the unfortunate reality. Whatever it is, okay? In recent history, it might go back to the televangelists of the 90s or the 80s.
Anytime you have high-profile ministers.
Before that, you could even go back to the slave-promoting preachers of the 1800s. I mean, there's plenty of fodder to be able to say, hey, look, we've got unbelieving people that mock us, not only because of our sins, but even the Christians who came before us. And you know what? They're not wrong. In terms of their assessment. Now, they may be wrong in terms of their rejection of God, but they're not wrong. We gave them that fodder. God, forgive us. And so one of the reasons I've taken this sort of interlude is because I want us to realize before we can really just grit our teeth and shake our fist at unbelievers around us, which hopefully we're not doing anyway, but
I was gonna say.
It's a temptation.
Yeah.
And a lot do. I mean, I'm on social media. I see lots of people that do it.
Yeah.
There needs to be that element where we look inward and say, God, you know what? Before I get too harsh, I need to look inwardly. He says, oh God, hear your servant's prayer. Listen as I plead. Now I like this. For your own sake, Lord, smile again on your desolate sanctuary. Again, oh my God, lean down and listen to me. We make this plea not because we deserve help, okay? It's not because we're all that. It's not because we're that holy. It's not because we've done everything right. He says, but because of your mercy, Lord, let your forgiveness, let your answer to prayer, let your help, let your grace, let your desire toward us be fulfilled, not because we deserve it, but for your name's sake, because we have been called by your name, because we have received your mercy. O Lord, hear. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, listen and act for your own sake. Do not delay, oh my God. I love how Daniel, he appeals not based on how great he is a church leader, church in the wilderness, Israel, whatever, church in exile, Babylon, or even the people were. But he's like, God, for your sake, please, please help us.
Great question, Cynthia.
We'll take that to the after party.
We're going to definitely take that to the after party. A lot of people have that question.
And it's not just Catholic priests.
Yeah.
It's, the Southern Baptists just announced publicly a bunch of abuse in their congregation, and wherever there are sinful humanity, that it's going to happen. So I'm not picking on denominations, but Daniel 9:20 says, I went on praying and confessing my sin and the sin of my people, pleading with the Lord my God. Now, if you keep reading, you see that the angel Gabriel shows up and says, hey, Daniel, you're a man beloved of God, and here, let me show you what's going to happen in the future. The point of this is realizing that, when you spend most of your time focused on God, help us to be right with you, rather than whatever the, cause du jour or activism of the day may be, the first and foremost responsibility we have is to be right with God.
Yeah, as Dudley said, removing the log in our eye before we get the speck of sawdust out of someone else's eye.
Correct. And so,
But the whole point in you kind of talking about this is the church is very quick to preach against sins, to be very harsh, and they're not wrong in what they're preaching. Oftentimes, it's straight out of the Word of God, while at the same time, though, ignoring that some of those very same sins are occurring in their leadership or in their churches, and they're just looking the other way.
yeah, you saw that in Romans.
And that's what you're trying to say is,
Yeah.
look, we can't keep looking the other way.
Romans 1 and 2.
You
Now,
have to start
the
dealing with
other
it.
extreme is this, because individuals realize, hey, you know what, we're not perfect, we've messed up, then they just take a hands-off approach. Well, who am I to judge? I'm just not going to say anything. And they, like Demas, abandon their prophetic responsibility, their pastoral
Right.
responsibility, and instead let sin run rampant.
Yeah.
They have no Phineas spirit that intervenes and says, no, time out. God's not cool with this.
Right.
So the response is not to overcorrect and go to the extreme of just letting it be a moral free-for-all because, well, who am I to judge? I mess up too.
Right.
No, it's a matter of saying, look, we have sinned, we need to do right, and so forth. That doesn't mean, okay, therefore we just let it happen. So, I mean, that's where you have to realize you're going to be
No, I
tempted
think the
to
point-
go, you're going to be tempted to go one of two extremes.
The point is judging on the outside just as much as you need to be judging on the inside. It's not a matter of just ignoring one or just I can't say anything about either one because it's happening in both cases. No, it's got to be righteous judgment on both sides.
That's why
and
Peter-
too often we sweep under the rug the things that are in-house.
Yeah, and that's why Peter said in 1 Peter, that I think it was 1 Peter, maybe it was 2 Peter, where he says judgment begins at the house of God. Where, look, we have to, you know, like Dudley said, let's get the log out of our own eye, because that's not something that God is cool with, you know, just because we happen to take a principled stand elsewhere. So,
Yeah. Hello, Myrna.
hello, Myrna. So when it comes to the reality of this, I just want to pray because I have no magic words or magic wand to make you not disillusioned or upset or even feeling betrayed
Right.
when somebody in the church, but particularly a church leader, sins and sins inexcusably. Instead, we pray for grace and we pray, God, help us to keep our eyes focused, you know, keep a well-worn path to Calvary for our own sake, realizing that it's, you know, it happened in the first century church. Peter dealt with it. John dealt with it. We can't be surprised that we have to deal with it too.
And like I said earlier, we have a responsibility for our own salvation to make sure that we don't allow that to distract us from our walk with the Lord. Because it's not just about us personally. You've got generations that are going to come after you. And the way you respond to the disappointment, the disillusionment, just maybe even just the overwhelming disgust maybe when you see a church leader fail is going to impact the generations coming behind you in your family, the legacy that you leave behind you. And so I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Too often we just get so focused on the moment and ourselves personally that we forget, you know, our faith is something we want to pass down to the next generation. And so how you pass that down is going to be determined often by how you respond to these kind of disappointments. And it's possible to still pass down a strong faith and provide balance to the generation coming behind you.
Yeah, bitterness is not a fruit of the Spirit,
No, it's not.
and sarcasm is not a spiritual gift, though some of us may feel that we have that gift. And so when it comes to this, it is significant, and I wanted to take a couple weeks to deal with it because it is out there now. It's getting overshadowed by a lot of the furor over what's happening in the culture at large, and there are probably some church leaders or ex-leaders that are really grateful for that. But the reality is that we have to be prepared, and that's where it is something where, when you are exposed to it and when you see I want you to view it almost as though God is pulling back a little bit of the curtain to let you see what he already saw. Okay? He said, look, I'm going to let you see what I saw regarding this person and what they were really living
He's
like.
so long-suffering, too.
And I am trusting you with this, that you are not going to get bitter, and that you will respond like the prophets and like Jesus himself, and that is to be an intercessor. Okay? Daniel, Moses, all these individuals, when they were, privy to the sins of the people, their response was intercession. It was not slander. It was not gossip. It was not embitterment. It was intercession. It was seeking God. And so realize that when the curtain gets pulled back and you unfortunately get to see sort of the seedy underbelly of maybe somebody that you, I hate to say idolized,
just thought highly of.
Yeah, or
respected,
or even an entire denomination or group or whatever. The response, again, that doesn't mean you don't protect yourself. That doesn't mean you excuse sin, but it does mean that the response biblically is intercession. And thankfully, we have a high priest that continually intercedes for us that we follow.
Well, and I think sometimes too, when we are, I use this word intentionally, when we are given the opportunity to really see the failings and shortcomings sometimes, and it's not everybody, but sometimes when you do see this, it is an opportunity because it gives you a chance to really see where your faith is. Is it in Christ? Or is it in a man? Is it in a certain denomination? And is there an area of your faith that needs to be shored up and strengthened? Is there weak spots? And that's why I just keep coming back to, it's so important that you don't lose your own salvation and your own faith in God because somebody else lost theirs. And really, when you get that opportunity to see that somebody was being hypocritical or they were a fraud or they fell into terrible sin or something, it's just an opportunity for you to see where is my faith and how strong is it and where does it need to be strengthened.
Yeah, and connected to that, and then we're going to go ahead and pray and take care of some announcements. But as we get ready to segue into just some things I want to talk to you about in regard to this last
and
week.
And answering Cynthia's question,
right.
too.
And that is that, unfortunately, we live in, and I had preached about this over a year ago, really a cancel culture. And it does not discriminate.
Yeah.
Okay, it's everywhere, every persuasion, Christian, non-Christian, whatever your politics and so forth. And that is, in some cases, there will be individuals who cancel family, friends, pastors.
You've been recently canceled.
Yes, I have. Based on things that aren't even sin.
Right.
Just based on a disagreement or a difference of opinion.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to...
That's why I said at the very beginning, I didn't use those words, but that's what I mean. Let's not cancel each other if we have a difference of opinion.
And I would say this, be very cautious of, who you demonize.
Yeah.
And make sure that you're not demonizing somebody that God isn't.
Yeah.
Because it's going to be very hard then for you to claim, the righteous cause if you are actually sinning against God.
Yeah.
So...
Great verse, Jessica. Thank you. I'm adding that to the broadcast.
I have determined to know nothing among you save Jesus Christ and Him crucified, that your faith should not stand in the knowledge of men, but in the power of God. So be it.
Thank you, Jessica.
Dudley says we all have feet of clay. Yes, intercession is a balanced response, denying neither discipline nor love. Yeah. I agree. And it's hard because in some cases, I remember a time where God basically said, don't you take this into your own hands. And I was just like, yeah, but I'll deal with it today, God.
God takes
I don't know how long I'm going to have to wait on you. I can handle it right now. But that's
what I mean. He's so long-suffering.
I wouldn't have handled it as well as
Well,
God
when
did.
I say that long-suffering, here's the thing. When something finally becomes public, I can promise you God has given that person maybe even years of opportunity to make it right in a way that's private and nobody ever has to know. because God is so gracious in that way. And I have watched it time and time again that when something finally becomes public and people finally know about it, there's always been lots of private opportunities for people to make things right. God is so long-suffering in that way. So long-suffering.
All right, let's pray, because it is one of those things where you may not feel like super enthused, like, wow, I just feel the God's presence so strong here. You know what?
Sometimes it's just inoculating you.
Yeah, it is equipping you for the reality of what is, the kingdom of God. And it was the reality in the first century. It's the reality in the 21st.
Yeah.
Father, as we close this up and get ready to sort of transition into other things, we ask that you would help us, first and foremost, to see where we need to make a holy life change, where we need to remove the beam from our own eye, and to have the commitment to truth and grace. The law came through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Help us to follow that model of grace and truth, of what love requires and of understanding what love doesn't require. Help us not to get disillusioned or embittered simply because of failings and betrayals and sins and so forth by individuals, whether they're church leaders or just Christians that we have appreciated. I pray, God, that you would help us to be able to keep our focus on you and to not lose our ability to intercede and to seek for your grace, because you are long-suffering and rich in mercy and love, just as Daniel prayed. And that is the God we pray to. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. So just before we go into the after party, just a few announcements here. If you have not joined our Monarchs online group, we invite you to do so. That is where we communicate throughout the week. If there's any announcements, we put those in there. And so you can join the Monarchs online group. We also have a free gift in that group for you. It's a private Facebook group. There's a welcome video pinned to the top, and attached to that welcome video is a link out to Right Now Media, which is a subscription-based Christian streaming service. Monarchs pays that subscription for you. We do not see your viewing activity, but there is something there for every age and stage of life. So if you've not activated that, we'd like to give that to you today, and that's in the Monarchs online group. Jeremy, thank you for putting all of the links in for us. We also have a private Monarchs Prayer Facebook group. We meet there Tuesdays and Thursday evenings for prayer. If you want to be a part of that, if you have prayer requests you want to put in, you can go ahead and join the Monarchs Prayer group. Again, it's a private Facebook group. Also, to all of you who are faithful in your giving, thank you so much for that. We do that at monarchs.church, which is our website, and you can set up your gifts as recurring gifts. You can give one time digitally, or you can mail to our P.O. box if you prefer to do that as well. So that's done at monarchs.church. And then if anybody had just any questions that was like, you know what, I've got questions for you, Pastor, but I don't really want to put them out. Maybe there's a personal situation. Either put the emoji in there or DM us. We will follow up with you. If there's something you specifically would like prayer for, you can put that emoji in or DM us. If you just say, you know what, I'm following Jesus, I just want to say it out loud, confess it today, put that emoji in. And if you have not been baptized, but you're like, Pastor, I know that's my next step, please let us know. If you do not live locally, we can make that happen for you wherever you live. But we would be happy to baptize you or connect you with someone who can in your area. So please just let us know either through a DM or through an emoji there in comments, and we'll follow up with you. So those of you that need to be done for the day and you've got plans, that's part of the summer hours. We know that people have things that they're doing during the day on Sundays. For a lot of families, that's really one of their only days off as a family. You are dismissed, but if you want to stick around for the after party, there's some comments we're going to go through, and then also we are going to discuss the abortion issue and the Supreme Court ruling on Friday. So I know some of you are anxiously awaiting to hear Pastor's thoughts on that as well.
Well, and let me let you know that Pastor's going to disappoint everybody. So
we might do this more in detail in another venue.
There'll be some things that are unsaid simply because they need a lot more polish.
Yeah.
But I will share some stuff simply because it is literally the conversation that everybody is having, and because it deals with really a moral issue regardless of where individuals stand on it, I want to speak to it. And I realize that I have friends, family, perhaps even congregants that look to me for spiritual leadership that will not embrace my view, to which I would trust that their love for me and their respect for me would at least give me a fair hearing. And that's the thing, too, that going back to what I said during the election season of 2020, when I was so proud in a good way of the Monarchs Church family, that while the rest of the world in terms of Christianity seemed to be acting like, well, fools regarding, political hit jobs online and everything else, I sensed that the people of God were like, you know what? I'm not going to attack my brethren. Mm-hmm. I may not understand why they vote the way they do or what they believe or whatever in that regard, but you know what? I transcend that because I'm part of the kingdom, first and foremost. And so that's sort of the mindset that I want us to have today. Yeah. So let's deal with the questions that came in before I deal with that.
Kathleen, have a good day. They have a local church they go to where they live. So they're headed there now. Dudley, we are always praying for you. So thank you for just reminding us. I've been praying for the Yeager family as well in our prayer group on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Yep.
I think Cynthia was really the only one who had a question in regards to the abuse of church leadership. And she said, I'm not sure I should bring this up or if it's relevant. I think it is relevant. But what about the Catholic priests that abuse children?
Okay, in a nutshell.
And this is happening not just in Catholicism.
Correct.
There's other denominations.
Correct. I'm going to say something that I do not mean it to sound...
Bye, Martha. Have a good day.
I don't mean it to sound as flippant or sarcastic as it will, because I honestly don't mean it that way. When individuals molest kids, or physically abuse them for that matter, it's serious.
Very.
Okay, and obviously I'm a mandatory reporter as a pastor, and there are other mandatory reporters, whether it's counselors, teachers, and so forth. So when it comes to that particular issue, whether it's a Catholic priest or a Protestant pastor or Joe Schmo, in the neighborhood, in my opinion, the authorities need to be involved.
And by authorities, you
police.
mean, yeah.
Yeah, and so what about
government?
What about them? Well, one of the benefits in America right now, and I don't mean this sarcastically, is that there really are a lot of really committed prison ministries out there, where individuals who, even in prison, can be exposed to the Word of God, can find a place of seeking repentance before God, but the consequences of the sin of molesting a child,
regardless of what your role is in society,
that's not something that you can sweep under the rug, because that child now, barring God, doing something miraculous, and in many cases he does, not necessarily removing all the consequences of what happened to them as a victim, but certainly being able to help them, thrive through it all. The fact is that when somebody does that to a kid, when somebody molests a child,
who's in spiritual authority,
more often than not, they're going to have to live with that brokenness now for the rest of their lives. So I think it is appropriate, that they face the consequences for those actions. And again, does that mean that they could never find forgiveness from God and so forth? Well, again, I'd like to think that there's only one unforgivable sin we read about in the New Testament. That having been said, will there be lifelong consequences for that individual, even if they were released from prison?
I don't think they should be in places of spiritual authority again.
Or even around kids.
Right.
And so I think in that regard, it's not inappropriate to say, you know what, they got justice. And so I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, and I think too, oftentimes what happens for pastors, priests, people who make church ministry their vocation, many don't have anything else they can do for work.
Correct.
They're either their education has been tailored towards that. It's really all they've ever done. And so sometimes people can be, feel like, well, if there was forgiveness, if there was some sort of discipline, they should be able to be restored. They have no other livelihood. I think you forfeit that when you decide to mess with kids, or not just kids. There's certain behaviors that are so disgusting to that particular, if you're a leader, as a church leader, there's some things that you just have forfeited your right to be in that vocation ever again.
Well,
it doesn't mean you can't be forgiven, but I just think that you forfeited that.
Again, one of the scariest scriptures for those of us
maybe how harsh, but
in church leadership is James 3:1. Let not many of you become teachers, knowing we shall receive a stricter judgment.
Yeah.
Now, people automatically assume that means the judgment of God. The context doesn't say that.
Right.
That may be true, but it's not. It doesn't say that. But when it comes to that, we know that the world will judge us more strictly.
yeah, we see that in our everyday lives as Christians.
Yeah.
People hold us to a different standard.
I'm a pastor. If a college student, falls into sexual sin, chooses to, not like, oops, I fell, chooses to commit sexual sin with a classmate or whatever, they're, both adults, there's no statutory rape or anything, and like, oh God, I messed up and I want to do right or whatever. Most people, including individuals that are, not Christians, are going to, appreciate the mercy of God and the mercy of the church. If I, as a pastor, do that same thing, all bets are off.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean,
even if you were a single pastor.
Yeah, because of the role and because of the authority and
standard
responsibility.
is higher. Yeah, there's a different responsibility. Coming in with a lot of agreement on just that, there's no space for them anymore in that vocation. Jana, she says this might be, no question here is a dumb question.
No.
But are Catholic priests not mandatory reporters?
That's an excellent question. I don't know the answer to that.
Why would they not be?
The reason why would be because of the structure of
The confession.
the Roman Catholic Church.
Where people come and confess.
No, has nothing to do with that. Has everything to do with who ultimately is an authority over those priests. Because the Vatican is actually a city-state and is recognized even with an American ambassador to the Vatican.
Yeah.
They
may not be considered U.S. citizens?
Well, no. Through most of church history, or through most of history, I should say, I think that a lot of times
I'm going to Google it. While you give your thoughts, I'm Googling.
The Roman Catholic, because it's a hierarchical church model of government rather than a congregational model of government, they view discipline to be something that is done within the structure of the
kind
Vatican.
of like how the Amish have. There's not all the laws apply to the Amish. I think with
maybe, but I think that may be the reason why they didn't report. They feel like if they confessed, or if somebody outed them to their bishop or their archbishop or whatever, and they went through whatever procedures. Now we know from just recent events, a lot of times they would just get transferred around and molest somebody else somewhere else, and that was a crime.
Oh.
And I think what you've found is, the Catholic Church has been sued for hundreds of millions of dollars as a result of this. And so at this point, I don't know, but I would think that they would be mandatory reporters, so that if they don't, that both they and the church hierarchy, the diocese or whatnot, would be held responsible.
speed limits don't apply to the Amish. Okay, so actually, first of all, not every state requires clergy to be mandatory reporters.
Interesting.
Which I did not know. And then also, because California is a mandatory reporting state, but under Roman Catholic law, it is forbidden for a priest to disclose information under any circumstances obtained in the form of religious confession. So if a priest confesses to another priest or something, they're not obligated to report it.
But what if a kid reports to a priest? And it's not a confession. It's just, hey, so-and-so told me to do this. Again,
I don't know.
It's been a while since Catholic school for me, so if I could ask some of the priests that I had in class, I would. I don't know if I have the answer to that. My suspicion is that if somebody was doing that, that some would report and others would seek to, deal with it in house. But unfortunately, we know
actually this is a huge controversy,
of kids have been hurt.
They're even the Catholic Church is actually trying to. They're campaigning against the states that require the clergy to be mandatory reporters. So, apparently, Jana, that's not a dumb question because lots of people have asked it. Lots of people have asked it on the Google. There's all kinds of articles about it. So now I'm fascinated. I'm gonna have to do a deep dive on it. So I don't know. Maybe I'll put what I find in the Monarchs Online group or something if you're curious about that. But Dudley said, I once worked in a children's home where many of the children had suffered abuse and neglect in their family life. It is a sad and tragic situation that leaves scars for life. Yeah, Absolutely. There's two, Dudley, and you pastored for a while. Anytime you pastor for any length of time, you get to hear these stories of children who are now adults, things that happened to them as a child that have completely altered their life, and it's serious.
And you can get a righteous indignation for what happened to that child that was not their fault, and at the same time feel extremely powerless because you can't just make it all go away.
No.
So yeah, it's tough stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So in our last minutes together here before we call it a day, for those who don't know. On Friday, the United States Supreme Court overruled the 1973 Roe v. Wade decision that had legalized elective abortion on demand nationwide. And so when it comes to just a few of my remarks on that, again, it's not going to be extensive. It'll probably leave everybody with a bad taste in their mouth, so I'm warning you in advance.
But Crystal's saying, I never understood people backing those who behaved wrong over just saying, yes, these folks have done this, and then distancing yourself from those. Instead, many people cover up and slide to the side. Absolutely. It's just kind of like a la la la, I'm not listening kind of thing.
And again, I think context matters. I don't know if there's any... you can take the guiltiest serial killer, put him on trial, and his mom is going to cry and say he's innocent. Okay, he didn't do it. Sometimes you realize...
Not this mama.
Well, yeah.
Not that I have a serial killer child on.
let it be, Rice Krispies and life and music.
Serial killer, ate too many bowls of life,
exactly.
And Rice Krispies and Cocoa
That's
Puffs.
the only kind we'll tolerate.
I killed that box so fast.
But what I'm saying is, I do think that depending on the context, there are individuals that emotionally they can't handle admitting the truth.
Yeah.
And so you have to understand sort of the context of that. And that's where it's helpful to have individuals that are not emotionally invested in the circumstance to be able to look at it neutrally and say, you know what, no matter how you slice it, this is wrong. And maybe they're just not emotionally capable of addressing it fairly, righteously, justly. So those of us who are have to. And that actually goes along with some of the other stuff I was going to talk to you about. But yeah, as far as
Jessica said, I use milk as my weapon. Jana, OMG, eating all the Rice Krispies is a crime in my house. I love Rice Krispies with strawberries, little bit of milk. I like them to stay crisp.
Yeah, and here's the deal, too.
You're so serious. We're still talking about cereal.
Well, I'm thinking about Crystal's point, too, and this may not even address what she meant by it, but there are times in which all of us have to live with our own cognitive dissonance and our own inconsistencies and our own, feet of clay, as Dudley had put it before. And what we have to realize is this. Simply because we may have jerkiness in us or inconsistency or even hypocrisy, that does not invalidate what the objective truth of the situation is. And so that's where being able to say, okay, what is objectively true and real here, regardless of whether individuals that hold to one perspective or another acting right or not, that's a side issue. It's an important one, but it's still a side issue. what's true here. So like in the case of kids getting messed with, that's the issue.
Yeah.
Not whether or not so-and-so was, well, boy, they coached Little League and everybody said how great they were or whatever. I mean, side issue, okay?
Right.
The kid is the focal point
That's
there.
right.
So
That's right. Thank you, Dudley. Appreciate that. Myrna said, priests should know it's imperative to report. Attorneys have accepted the consequences of losing their license to find ways to disclose client confessions because of the nature of the crime.
And for what it's worth, I have told individuals in advance when they were like, look, I got to come and
They didn't believe you.
confess something to you or whatever. And I tell them in advance, look, I said, I'm here to help you spiritually. But if I'm told that a kid is getting messed with, particularly sexually, I am a mandatory reporter. And beyond that, I'm going to. Because protecting the innocent is got to be my first priority. Fortunately, it's not happened a lot because I guess people don't want to confess that to me, go figure. But
and there have been times where they didn't really believe that you would report it,
and I did.
You went ahead and confessed it, and you did report it, and they didn't like that.
Yeah, I reported the kid getting messed with.
You're right, Dudley. I think the medical profession is as well.
I reported, and of course that made me the bad guy.
Yeah.
But anyway, I won't digress into that. Again, like I said, this particular topic, if you're, certainly if you're interested in me delving more into it from a, theological and apologetic perspective, I'm happy to do so more formally, including with scriptures and explanations and so forth. So I'm going to sort of spitball a little bit here. And I'm going to ask that we, sort of keep our proverbial, grenades in our pockets, rather than just, throw them out there. But there was a ruling that obviously impacted our nation. There are many of us, myself included, who have very close friends, family, so forth, that are all over the map in terms of their reaction to this. Mm-hmm. And I think that there is a need to be able to transcend. Now, that having been said, it's story time. Okay? Are we ready for story time? I've got a few stories to tell, and I won't necessarily wrap them all up in a tiny little bow, but I'm going to tell you a few stories and then, share a few thoughts. When I was back in Ohio, which is where I'm from, even prior to my conversion, I had a close friend, really one of my closest friends.
That's a good question, Jeremy.
That became pregnant with what is referred to as an ectopic pregnancy, which, again, I know we have individuals here that know more about it than I, but my understanding is basically, the egg is fertilized, but before it can implant in the womb, it gets stuck in the fallopian tube and it ain't moving, and the result is catastrophic in terms of it can kill the mom, and obviously the baby wouldn't survive anyway. And so my friend, who was really torn up about it, more so than I realized at the time, had the ectopic pregnancy terminated and so forth. That is not, in my opinion, again, an example of elective abortion on demand.
No, I wouldn't even classify it as abortion.
There was a New York Times article of a medical missionary in Africa who, he's a minister as well as a medical doctor, and vehemently, by his own admission, pro-life. And he was faced with a circumstance where, especially where he was at, out in the middle of nowhere, a woman who did not want to abort her baby, but was hemorrhaging severely. And all his training and all his expertise told him, I have to get this hemorrhage under control or I lose them both. Mm-hmm. But, and again, you can look it up in the New York Times article if you Google it or whatever. It's a fascinating read. It really is. But he realized the only way I can save one is to, terminate the other. And he talked about just what an emotional decision it was for him personally, given his views on the matter. But he realized, I can either lose both or I can save one. And he made a decision that I think was morally correct. And so when it comes to this, there's
Are you going to tell what the decision was?
yeah, he aborted the child to save the mother, because it was a no-brainer. You know, she's going to die in minutes if I don't do this. And so when it comes
And
to
the
this,
child was going to die too.
oh yeah,
wasn't it?
yeah, they both would have died. And so when it comes to this, there's a lot of broad brush out there, of, you know, this side believes this and this side believes this, and, you know, this side is
What about these situations?
yeah, a bunch of this, that, and the other. And to which I think it's fair to be able to say, you know what? Unless you have good faith, calm, civil discussions with individuals who, you know, have a different view, it's always easy to demonize and slander and mock and so forth. And again, I think we're called to transcend all that. Now, story time. When I was also back in Toledo, I had another friend, not as good a friend as the one I had mentioned before. And obviously, none of you would know them even if I mentioned them by first name, but I'm not going to do that. And this friend of mine, unbeknownst to me, had conceived a child via rape. She had been raped. And so when it comes to, you know, when it came to her decision, I found out after the fact that she chose to abort the product of conception, if I can, you know, use that terminology. It was still something that, you know, I won't get into how it weighed on her and the trauma and so forth. And I think the only right response to a situation like that is nothing but compassion.
Exactly.
Okay, I mean, she was a victim of a crime, an unspeakable crime, and the fact that she was as, you know, well-adjusted and normal a human being, you know, given that circumstance, I give her credit for. On the flip side, I remember a time, and again, I want to be very cautious with this, where I pastored it was a mom and son. The son was an adult son, young adult, very young, and came into the church, got to baptize them, you know, wonderful future ahead, really cool, close connection and so forth. She told me what the son didn't know. And she said, my son doesn't know this, but he was conceived via rape. And she chose to basically just, you know, raise him as a single mom, and their relationship, you know, was wonderful and so forth. And so her, you know, decision in that regard was a little different. I say all that to say a couple things. When it comes to what I'll call the hard emotional cases, which make up statistically about 2% of all abortions, again, whether we're talking about rape, incest, the life of the mother, and so forth. Thankfully, I mean, if it were 50%, we got a bigger problem. Okay, I mean,
Yeah.
that's
If we've got that many from rape or incest, that's a huge other issue.
you know, so when it comes to that, I'm going to ask that we sort of take that 2% of what I call the real hard cases, sort of set those to the side, and realize that the compassion needed does not have, you know, a spitballing answer that will suffice today. Now, we can address that in a different, you know, circumstance. Now, I liken it unto this: when our mutual friend Mike, died in a boating accident. One of the, I mean, just horrible, in front of his children.
Horrible.
There was a normal response by a lot of people emotionally, because he was a good man. He was a good father, a good husband, a godly man. And here he dies tragically in what was just an accident. It wasn't even, you know, it wasn't like somebody did something to him. And the normal question was, why would God allow this? Now, when it comes to the question, why would God allow this? Context in how we answer matters. As a pastor, I have two different tracks that are not the same. With the question, why would God allow this evil or this suffering and so forth? There is the theological and philosophical answer to that question, that if it is in a classroom, if it is in a teaching situation where I'm teaching from the pulpit and so forth, I can address that, you know, very intellectually, you know, some might even say coldly, not because I'm wrong, but because I realize we are dealing with the subject of, as Christians, how do we reconcile the reality of, you know, a good and loving God and the presence of evil, and why he would allow it, and so forth. And there are answers. There are good answers. I've taught on it before. I'm sure I'll teach on it again. in the heat of emotion, like in the case of Mike and his funeral or his kids, the last thing that compassion would require of me, or one of the last things that compassion would require of me, would be to go to those kids or to get up, at his funeral and give a eulogy and explain, oh, by the way, if you want to know why God would allow a tragedy like this to happen, let me regale you with the theology and philosophy behind it.
Nobody cares at that point.
Okay? So what you have to realize is when it comes to issues of this that have really a moral component, but also can be very emotional, particularly for individuals that have, directly been impacted by it. There is the emotional way of discussing it, and in some cases, the emotional way of handling it is to not even discuss it. Because you realize compassion does not demand I get into a fight right now. Okay? And then you have the philosophical, theological,
almost textbook discussion.
Intellectual, okay, and that's why it's so important that when emotions are not running high, you look at the, more of the intellectual, philosophical, theological, and say, okay, what is the truth? Okay? Not something that, I would go to a grieving widow or whatever and just spew. Okay? No. But this is really, we've wrestled with it, we've done the hard work intellectually and so forth, and this is what we have decided. And what we have to realize is this. There are times in which, in an honest difference of opinion, individuals have to be willing to look at it that way. Mm-hmm. And it's actually dishonest to do nothing but pull the emotion and say, you know what? I know you want to have a good faith discussion about this, but I'm not going to. I'm going to throw the most emotional scenarios in a way to really sort of muddy the waters. And unfortunately, that ends up spreading more heat than light. Mm-hmm. And if we'll be honest, when it comes to this issue, both sides can do it. And let me just give one more story that sort of leads into my thoughts on what happened this past week. When I was in our previous pastorate, there was a young man who was, I believe, a junior in high school. And he came to me. He said, I was in government class this week, and something interesting happened. I wanted to run it by you. And I said, what happened? He said, well, my teacher decided to spend the class basically trumpeting the success of Roe versus Wade and the constitutional right for abortion in a way that was really mocking of anybody who held otherwise to a different position, to a different perspective. And the whole class is laughing with him and basically using his position to really bully the class into accepting what he was saying, which involved a lot of mockery, some hostility. And here he was, as a relatively young person of faith, asking his pastor, I'm not sure what to make of this, because, when it comes to the issue of elective abortion on demand, I would consider myself on the pro-life side. And I said, well, let me ask you a favor. I said, will you write this down? And I want you to present this to your government teacher. And he said, sure. And he did. And I said, would you tell your government teacher, by the way, I had talked with my pastor about the last class and what you had said and how you had said it and so forth. And he asked if I would pass this on respectfully to you. My pastor happens to have his degree in history and knows that this is a secular government class, dealing with social sciences, social studies. So he wanted to know, would you allow him to come in and the two of you have a discussion where he takes a position, leaves religion out of it completely, doesn't mention the Bible, doesn't mention God, but looks at it from the lens of government, constitutionality, and so forth. And he'll take the perspective that Roe versus Wade was not, good law and so forth, and you can take the other position and then let the class vote on it. And he said, so I took it to my teacher. And I asked him, I said, what did the teacher say? He said, the teacher said this, and I quote, "There's no way I'm going to let your pastor come into my classroom and embarrass me." I said, "Oh, okay." I wasn't threatening. I wasn't, demonizing. I wasn't bad-mouthing. I said, we'll do this completely secular. And so when it comes to what occurred this last week, the first question, as far as what does love require of me? Does love require of me that I am able to love my brothers and sisters in Christ, even if they have a different view from me in this? Yeah, I'll let you answer that. I think you know the answer. Now, and the question is, do I? Can I in that regard? And if not, why not? Because in many cases, I think it does come down to, either ignorance or emotion. And both of those, I think we can have compassion on. But when it came to, the particular ruling and so forth, just as again, my opinion on it was that both sides, whether it's the sides that were, dancing in the streets and popping champagne, or whether it was those that were rioting in the streets and screaming whatever, I think both sides probably missed it in this regard. First of all, and I remember even when the first leak came forth, I think I had told my kids or whatever, abortion ain't going anywhere. I mean, it's, in this particular case.
This ruling didn't make abortion illegal.
No, it simply said that the 1973 ruling was judicial overreach. It was basically making law from the bench, which is in America and in the American system, unconstitutional. It's not the court's
You should probably
job.
explain that a little bit more, because I don't think people really understand that. And that's part of why we have such high emotions right now about this and this reversal, because people don't understand the judicial system and the role of the Supreme Court.
In 1973, when the Supreme Court, which happened to be, 7 white men, as far as I recall, made this decision, it was something that then proclaimed the legality of elective abortion on demand. And again, we're going to talk about the 98% and save the 2%, more hard cases for another discussion. Because in most cases, what I have found is that most individuals, even if you were to say, okay, well, let's exempt the 2%, they're not willing to give up the 98%. And I will say this, from my perspective, and I say this unapologetically, for reasons that have to do with logic, science, theology, a combination of factors, I am unapologetically would be considered, I guess, in what's been labeled the pro-life camp. And I do think that when it comes to taking that perspective and position, I can, not, again, I wasn't going to go in there and humiliate that government teacher, but I do think I can give reasons why I am that way. This is probably not going to happen today.
No, but you're getting away from what we were originally going to talk about, and this is where Crystal's comment coming in. Her biggest concern is the justification for the ruling and the precedent that sets for other change. This is where we were talking. You were going to
the legality.
You got distracted.
Ultimately,
I'm the one who's going to keep them on track, folks.
Ultimately,
you started to say that the ruling was in 1973 by 7 white men that made.
Well, when it comes to, for instance, the constitutional right, even the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg lamented Roe versus Wade as a ruling. She knew it was bad law. She and other pro-choice jurists and legal scholars actually expected that it would be overturned because of its weakness. As I've read after her, she actually thought that the decision really galvanized more of a pro-life movement that wouldn't have occurred otherwise. That Instead, the states in America were moving in a certain direction that Roe basically threw a monkey in that wrench. And so,
well, it's not the Supreme Court's job
Right.
to make laws.
Correct.
And so that's what happened with the Roe versus Wade, is
Correct.
they made a law which was outside of their jurisdiction. It was supposed to be voted on by the people.
Right. And
So
so-
that's why the whole point of people wanting it reversed is because it's not how the judicial system is supposed to work.
So, for instance, because you said you're probably going to leave both sides with a bad taste in their mouth. Yeah, let me explain what I mean by that. From the perspective of those, including individuals I know, who would say, women have been disempowered. Actually, no. Women in 1973 were disempowered.
Exactly.
Because they were disempowered of their right to vote or have their elected representatives vote as per prescribed by the Constitution. Instead, it was, taken away and ruled on by, again, the 7 justices who did it accordingly. Now, had that been a law passed by Congress, or had that been a law passed by individual state legislatures, which it had been in some cases, then you would have to say, okay, that is considered a law, that abortion is a moral, good or legality or whatever. But it hadn't been. And so, as a result, to be able to say that, okay, now the states will decide for themselves, the people, their representatives and so forth, will determine whether or not, in their constitution, state constitutions, that will constitute something that is either illegal or legal, or if it's legal, what restrictions will be placed on it. So in that regard, I do think that I guess I would agree with Ruth Bader Ginsburg and some of the other pro-choice justices that acknowledge, okay, this was not necessarily good law.
Well, Crystal, to your point here, I would agree that that's not why the majority of the people wanted it reversed, was because it wasn't done correctly in the first place, and it was not voted on. I think that this is where both sides have gotten off track and don't really understand that the reversal of this is not really doing away with abortion. It is now putting the power in the states and the people's hands to determine whether or not it's going to be laws, which now has the opportunity for it later to become a law by Congress if you have enough states and representatives wanting it to be. So it doesn't do away with it.
Well, and let me say this as, again, remember I said the difference between the emotion and the intellectual. This is going to lean more toward the intellectual. But the motives of the people who wanted it reversed are ultimately irrelevant.
Yeah.
The issue is, was it constitutional? And you have both pro-life and pro-choice jurists that acknowledged this was dumb, bad law.
So when you have people in which I've
that
seen...
shouldn't have been a law because it was not passed by the legislative body.
I've seen quotes going around saying that women have lost what has been a 50-year constitutional right to abortion, which by definition, 50 years as a constitutional right.
The only way that would be the case is if there had been an amendment passed that made it a right according to the Constitution.
Right.
No such amendment existed because in 1973, 75% of the states were actually anti-abortion. Mm-hmm. And had it been voted on in 1973, it never would have passed.
Right.
And so in that regard, individuals that would say, remember how I said, even if individuals are complete hypocrites and jerks and have bad motives and so forth, it doesn't really follow that the objective case at hand is either validated or invalidated by the obnoxiousness of its, proponents or opponents. So in this particular case, to put the burden back on the states, that's another subject altogether. Because people might say, well, it makes it inconvenient for people who live in certain states. They would have to travel here or whatever. Again, ultimately, if you're just talking about the legality of it, it's irrelevant. You go back to the American founding, you had Maryland was a Catholic colony and became, Catholic state. If you had others that they had their religion written into the Constitution of their state. Now, if people didn't want to be in a Catholic or Congregationalist state or whatever, they can move to another one. And I'm not saying that flippantly. I remember, even when I was a kid, people probably don't remember this.
Well, apparently not all clergy are mandatory reporters in every state.
Yeah.
And I think federally it should be.
There's a case in point.
Yeah.
Where even states differ in whether or not clergy have to report, sexual molestation of children.
Yes.
Again, and that's where, again, living in a representative republic means we then have the voice and the power to affect a change in those laws.
Which was Ruth Bader Ginsburg's point, is when they decided arbitrarily as a Supreme Court to make this a legal right without representation of the people, she said now all of a sudden this became a forefront issue that if it had just been left up to the states, it probably would have been signed into law years ago and would have gone under the radar.
Well, not everywhere, but in some states.
But in a lot of cases it would have been, and that was her point. Her point was by the way they kind of did it, it actually shed more attention on it than if they had just sort of quietly let the states do their thing. And so Jeremy asked a really important question, and is how do we, I don't want to get it exactly how in light of the polarized nature of the Roe v. Wade abortion debate, what do you think are the primary points of agreement that we could build bridges from? And I think that's what's really important here, is being able to build bridges, because we are going to have people, even within the body of Christ, have a difference of opinion about this, which I know for some people that's shocking that there would be. There absolutely are.
I have a pastor that I am in a small group cohort with, that he and I have gone round and round about a number of things, including this issue here. And so when it comes to the ability to actually transcend and think it through and give people the benefit of the doubt and the ability, hopefully, to, I don't want to say evolve, but learn and imagine and so forth. I mean, when it comes to this issue, I think it boils down to the one simple question. I won't get into it right now because we're going to run out of time. And like I said,
I think we should have like a bigger, longer, more open discussion where people can interact on this.
Well, and maybe
even more than just comments.
Maybe next Sunday I'll go ahead and present more of a formal type deal, because like I said, today is more just sort of spitballing after the case. When it comes to quote unquote the constitutional right to an abortion, and again, this is something that I think legal scholars who are honest, regardless of their view of abortion, will say there's nothing in the Constitution, there's nothing in the amendments, even the whole privacy argument. No, it doesn't hold legal water. It has nothing to do with your moral position, because even pro-choice jurists are aware. Look, this is weak sauce. And so when it comes to what's legal, do I believe that this ruling this last week was defensible from a legal perspective? Yeah, if anything, I think that even most intellectually honest jurists across the spectrum probably wondering why it took 50 years. It probably should have been hashed out much earlier. And that's where, again, in our system, now, if we were in a different country, obviously China is not a representative republic, but in America, that's where it would have been handled through the legislative process, which is, again, the power of the people as voters, citizens, and their elected representatives. That's what's going to happen now. And so as a result, you're going to have probably half of the states that either outlaw it or restrict it, and then you're going to have probably half the states that don't.
Well, you said at the very beginning this morning that there's actually a lot of ignorance on both sides. And so that's why these arguments become so heated. There's these just rhetoric that's constantly spewed because people don't really understand the issue, which is why we're taking the time to even explain the judicial process and why, reversing it did not eliminate abortion. Now, in some states, that's going to be the case. But as far as just a reversal of Roe v. Wade does not mean that Americans cannot get abortions. And so I don't know, Jeremy, maybe that's somewhere where the bridge can occur in conversations, is even just through educating people that the stuff they're seeing just spewed is not fully truth.
I think that the bridges, to Jeremy's point or his question, I think the bridges are probably going to be more holistic. Obviously, when it comes to just dealing with this topic, this is a big enough burrito that we're going to need more than one meal to eat. But when it comes to building those bridges, I think it has to go beyond just the issue of abortion, because, again, you have to take a step back and find a lot of the why. Okay? What are the precursors? What are the reasons? What leads up to it? And again, I'm not talking about, the 2% that I mentioned before. That's something that requires different dealings, and it certainly doesn't apply.
And I wouldn't even say like
to the ectopic.
I wouldn't even call those abortions.
No. So, but when it comes to this other issue, you're going to see a lot of things as far as poverty, and what about helping moms, single moms. What about the responsibility of men, involved in it, and so forth? What are the factors involved in that? And I think that's where there are actually bridges that could be built in terms of, okay, you know what? This is a really emotional and divisive topic, but if we take a step back and look at the contributing factors that make it so prevalent,
which is kind of what Crystal's getting at.
Where would we agree that, okay, these things here, if we could address these, all of a sudden, whether we, realize it or not, we're sort of cutting the roots, whereas abortion might be the fruits, we're getting to the roots. Now, from a personal perspective, do I think that the roots are far deeper than just political solutions?
And that's what Crystal's starting to bring up, some of the social issues that are surrounding this, which those roots are not in whether or not somebody can have an abortion or have access to abortion free or any of that. There's roots that abortion is just now a possible solution because of other issues socially that we have chosen not to deal with. That we need to be having discussions about, and we need to come up with solutions for.
Right, and I certainly don't claim to have the answers. I do have some opinions, and I really think that. When I say incentivizing, I mean incentivizing in some ways that would be outright strong-arming.
some of your ideas you were telling me the other day for men to be incentivized was
I think that's probably
if we did that, we probably wouldn't have much need for abortion.
I think that incentivizing men, and again, I don't have, it's not anything I'm going to just spitball, but I think that would play a large role.
Because that's a lot of women's complaint is there is, once you have. There's no repercussion usually for men. They walk away, and that's the meme I'm seeing everywhere. And there's truth to that, and women are left with this unwanted pregnancy. And so we were talking about just what would be some of the ways in which you would incentivize men to be much more considerate about this whole process. She's like, I would love to hear those ideas.
No, and I may share them, but I would need to sort of formulate them a little more.
Yeah, I think we'll revisit this, like you said.
But and it doesn't just address the issue of abortion. It addresses the root issues, including whether it be unwed pregnancy, whether it be poverty, all sorts of things that my guess is that there are a lot of solutions that nobody on both sides really wants to talk about touch.
That's true. Crystal, I love your enthusiasm and your willingness to really discuss it. I love that.
Yeah, and this is where, too...
I'll take the unfiltered.
This is where, too, there's a difference between what I as a citizen and I as a pastor. I as an individual with values that I think are valid in terms of my view of how we should handle things living in a representative republic versus what I think is a theological perspective for Christians.
Right.
Now, they may overlap, but only with the one that is more secular can I speak to the culture at large. Now, to those who consider themselves Christians, yes, I believe I can speak then with the theological perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And with the theological perspective, well, thank you, Minnie.
I don't know if CNN would have us, Myrna.
It'd be a short one. Okay, it'd be a short one. No, I think when it
It would be fun though.
no, yeah, all 10 seconds of it.
Yeah. I would agree with that.
That's where when it comes to what is meant by being to Jeremy's point about bridges, you're also talking then about what occurs prior to conceptions, births, abortions, whatever, but then you're talking about after the fact as well. Now, here's the thing, like I said, that is going to be difficult for a lot of individuals. There's a lot of sloganeering on both sides. There's a lot of bumper sticker and
drives me crazy.
Whatever. That may make somebody feel good about themselves, but it doesn't really affect much in the way of meaningful, moral change. And when it comes to this, I've watched individuals that would invalidate, for instance, oh, you're a man, or oh, if you're not willing to, provide, the food and diapers and college education and whatever for that child all the way
it's just a
to natural
dismissive. It's
death,
just being dismissive.
Then you can't. Well, again,
it's not an honest conversation.
well, what I was going to say is that the logic doesn't follow. Even if I was just a cold-hearted jerk, as much as some think, that doesn't that doesn't make the argument any different. I mean, the fact is, if we boil it down to, and I won't get into it today, boil it down to the question, what is the unborn? And the bottom line is, if the unborn is a unique human, then no justification for abortion is tolerable. If the unborn is not human, then no justification for abortion is needed.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it really is that simple. And if you ask, well, why has it been such a big issue? Again, this is one of my unfiltered moments. I think both political camps have realized for 50 years, this is good fundraiser. This is a good way to get out votes. We ain't going to do much about it, especially, the one side who claim to be pro-life. But boy, can we raise money off it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Boy, can we manipulate voters off it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so nobody...
It's become the platform.
Yeah,
that
nobody
everybody
really
runs on.
wanted to address the question. Now, for instance, I have, many of you have heard of my longtime friend who is a medical doctor. He also happens to be, for decades, very consistent in terms of being on what would be considered the pro-choice camp. And he said something to me once where he said, I'm not arrogant enough to claim to know when life begins. So I don't think that I can then, favor laws that would mandate, restrictions and so forth. And I said, well, wait a minute. I said, you're a doctor. I said, if you're in doubt, wouldn't your oath and wouldn't common sense dictate that if you're in doubt, don't kill? And he said, you know what? That is actually one of the best points I've ever heard. Now, I do think when it comes to the science of embryology, again, remember how I said sloganeering oftentimes doesn't work very well? Because it's like, I see things, even in my neighborhood here, we believe in science. Well, except for when we talk about embryology or, male, female, sexual binary.
The science that's inconvenient.
Yeah, or the fine-tuning of the universe pointing to the existence of God. It's amazing. It's like science needs a little trademark next to it.
Selective
Not
science.
Not meaning science, but meaning our religious science, whatever. And it's like, so when it comes to this, I think that... the bottom line going forward is that everyone is going to have their respective emote fest.
Well, that's what I wanted to speak to Dudley's point about that.
And at the end of the day, what will change? Well, restrictions in certain states. Might there be a handful of individuals who rather than go through the hoops of having to get to a state that allows it, opt to have the baby instead? Sure. Might it curtail some abortions in America, resulting in, live births and so forth? I would imagine. That having been said, for the individuals that are popping champagne and dancing for joy, is it really going to stop?
We haven't solved anything.
The majority of the 1 million plus abortions every year, probably not.
No, the reversal has solved nothing, and it hasn't.
Well, I will say
it really hasn't. It's solved the judicial issue.
Yeah.
But it has not done away with abortion, as everybody wants to think. Both parties want to believe that it's completely done away with abortion, and it has not. I want to speak, though, to Dudley's point here. Okay. And Crystal, we all are in agreement with you that there should be a lot done before we ever get to the point of a woman needing an abortion. And I agree with the statement you had made much earlier that there's not a woman out there that really feels good about having had to make the decision.
My view,
it's not easy.
My view, and I think it would be ministerial malpractice if I didn't say this. So I'm going to shift from the secular legal more into the ministerial theological. But again, not talking about those 2%, including the ectopics and the life of the mother and so forth. But I do think that, again, it would be ministerial malpractice of me if I were to say that I didn't consider the elective. And when I say elective, meaning it wasn't a medical necessity. Mm-hmm. It was a choice. It was an mm-hmm. optional choice, more as birth control for whatever reason. I do not consider that to be a morally defensible position. Right. I consider that actually to be, morally wrong. Right. And I do think that when it comes to that, there is no, like I said, with the exceptions, with few exceptions, I wouldn't even use the term need. Okay, it is not medically necessary for an abortion except in these cases. So when we talk about women need an abortion. Before we get to the point where women need abortion,
need access.
That's where I would part company from a pastoral perspective.
Right. So Dudley keeps coming back to, and I think this is an important point. And Jessica witnessed something last night that is right along the lines with this. Mm-hmm. Is just that there is still this very emotional side. So. And we've been talking with our kids, obviously, about it this weekend. It's not a very, it's really not a black and white issue, like many Christians want to think that it is. And that's not saying that you can't have a position. It's just not as clean and simplistic as we like to make it out to be. But Jessica witnessed a situation last night in where she wasn't a part of the discussion. She was a witness to the discussion. And they were having a discussion about the reversal, and there was actually an attorney at the table who was looking at it from more of the judicial perspective, and then there was someone who was very emotional and got very hostile and was yelling and eventually confessed, to having...
We got to be careful about what we share.
Well, I'm not saying who any of these people were. You shared stories. It's my story time now. And confessed to having had a few abortions, and even had to leave the room at one point in tears, just at the memory of it. So this is extremely emotional for a lot of people, and I agree with Dudley that as Christians, we have to be sensitive to that. And when we discuss this issue, that's why you said there's two tracks to this.
Right.
There's the theological and philosophical track where we can talk about it, and then there's the personal, emotional, real life scenarios with real people who are made in the image of God, mm-hmm. that we have to ask ourselves, what does love require of me? That doesn't mean we change our position because of these emotional, but how we speak to it. And I think going back to what Jeremy's like, where do we build those bridges? Because when for 50 years this has been something that's accessible and free in all 50 states, the number of women who have made this decision, not just once but multiple times, is significant. And there's also men. We've talked to men where this was the choice that was made, and it haunts them as well. Right. And so we do need to be sensitive to that.
Or men who basically forced women into it.
Yeah.
And so when it comes to
so there's multiple layers to this discussion, mm-hmm. multiple bridges that can be built. It is not a simple black and white subject.
Well, here's the Well, depending on what you're talking about.
If you're
'Cause what makes it not simple is the emotional component, but then also the legal component because
Right.
of
But if you're talking about the science and the embryology, that's a whole nother discussion. And that might be more black and white because it's scientific. But I think we have to be sensitive too to realize there are a lot of people that even just the fact that this is in the news and the fact that this is being, you
Stirring up
can't
a lot
go
of
through
emotion.
Facebook without somebody's thoughts on it. There are women who nobody even knows they've done this that are having to probably not go on Facebook right now because it is stirring up so much pain for them.
And I, as a pastor, even before I was a pastor and so forth, have dealt with this with individuals who have
Yeah.
come to me and so forth. And again, I don't think that anybody advocates for, especially in the environment of America where it was, again, whether or not it was a good judicial ruling or not, it was legal nationwide up until recently. So as a result, how you dealt with individuals who had experienced that. I remember a coworker of mine who I didn't even bring it up or whatever, but she did. And I don't think it was because she had had an abortion. Maybe she had, I don't know. She never told me. But when she said, well, it's just a clump of cells, and I basically said, well, except for ... And the look on her face was one of she wasn't mad at me, but it was one of like shock and horror, like,
She didn't know.
what? Really? And I think that's where, when we look at this issue from, the practical bridge building and so forth. Jeremy, to your point, I don't think that when bombs are being dropped and screaming and shrieking and all that is happening, that anybody's going to build much in the way of bridges. That's more burning. You can't burn a bridge and build a bridge at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Good question, Sam. Does this mean the government will stop funding abortion? Has there even been any discussion about that at this point?
You know what? That's ironic too, because even the federal government, even under administrations that would have claimed to be pro-life or whatever, again,
I've never defunded abortion.
yeah, I think in many cases it was just, like I said, it was get out the vote fundraising more than anything.
My guess is they're going to continue to fund in the states that allow for it.
Yeah, that would be my
Yeah.
guess. And
I haven't seen anything that talks about defunding, which is why I keep saying this huge celebration of thinking abortion has been abolished in our country. It's just simply not true. It's not true at all. And Dudley said, where's the right of the father to decide against abortion when the mother chooses to terminate?
yeah, and that is an issue, particularly if it's, what if they're married? What if, and he really wanted, there's a lot of moral conundrums when it comes to this, that it's not as simple. And that's why when people say it's a political issue, no, not really. It has become political or become politicized, but it really is an emotional issue. It is a physical issue. It is a moral and spiritual issue. And because of that, the solutions and the discussions of it are not going to be solved just by snapping our fingers. And certainly not going to be solved by, screaming, demonizing, castigating, accusing, and so forth. Like I said, you can't burn and build a bridge at the same time. But individuals may not be interested in building that bridge. And again, the question is, what is the desired outcome? If the desired outcome is to honor image bearers of God, because it comes down, again, I'm not going to get into the theology this time, but maybe next week, the Imago Dei, the being created in the image of God and what that means, including, women, including, unborn children, men, and what they bring to the table and so forth. We have to be able to, look at all of that as Christians.
I think we need to have secret church on this. And yes, we were referring to federal government too. The federal government will still fund the states just as they do now. Those that are legal, they're still going to keep it legal. Crystal coming in with a scenario of like a 16-year-old girl who gets pregnant, 18-year-old boy says too bad, the parents kick her out. What's her choice now? There's a ton of, actually, and this is a whole nother issue the crisis pregnancy centers
that are being firebombed.
that are being
That's just evil. Okay.
But what people don't realize in the state of California, at least, the crisis pregnancy centers are now required to actually include in their literature the nearest place they can get an abortion. So these other choices that girls are being given, abortion is still constantly in the forefront, but these crisis pregnancy centers that have been established for a scenario
For a
exactly
choice.
like what you put in there, Crystal, their hands are being very tied, and they're very legislated, at least in the state of California, when it comes to this.
Well, and again, Crystal brings up a point that I think
I think we can take these
is valid, and I'll sort of hopefully tie it up with this. And it's a story.
Yeah,
It's a true story. You have an unwed teenage girl who gets pregnant. Okay, and she was admittedly a willing participant in the events that led up to her pregnancy. She happens to be very poor. She's also a person of color, and she's living in a society that was dominated really by white privilege and oppression. It made her place and opportunities in the world very limited. Okay, even before the prospect of becoming a teenage, mom. Her expectation is that her family, because they're very religious, are not going to understand or support her, and they've raised her in such a strict religious upbringing that she also has realistic expectation that she's going to get hit with shame and criticism and condemnation by those, in her family and her family's sphere. And if all this wasn't hard enough, her much older boyfriend, considerably older, decides to bail out on the relationship and is content to leave her to deal with this responsibility without his emotional, financial, or practical support. The question is, what would we advise her to do should she consider abortion? Now, if you answer yes, you've just aborted the Lord Jesus Christ.
It was Mary's story.
So when it comes to this, the very first individuals, perhaps the first individual to recognize Jesus as the Messiah, was the preborn John the Baptist in the womb of Elizabeth, who leapt for joy when Mary brought the preborn Christ into their midst. Elizabeth even prophesied, "Why is the mother of my Lord come before me?" And at this point, just in terms of months, the preborn Jesus would not have been considered quote unquote viable to live outside the womb. Yet, the angel gave instructions to name both Jesus and John while they were in utero. You don't give names to clumps of cells. You give names to people. From a theological perspective, we are incarnationalists. We believe that God saved us by becoming one of us. Okay? Well, guess what? That physicality of humanity literally began as an embryo. And there is an ancient heresy called adoptionism that wrongly promoted that Jesus became God later, like at his baptism or whatever, and the Spirit descends. And that's really when he became God. And of course that was condemned as a heresy because Jesus has always been who he is, fully God, fully human. Well, guess what? God is spirit, human is physical as well as, spirit. When God incarnated himself in humanity, it didn't begin when he exited the womb of Mary. And we know this, again, from Scripture, as well as logic and common sense.
The angel says, the child within you.
There was not a point in time, if we, that heresy that I mentioned before is called adoptionism, believes that, Jesus became God later. If we think that
God adopted that body.
Yeah, that Jesus became God, like in the second trimester? That is a heresy from a Christian perspective. There is never a time in which the physical being, the physical humanity, which again had unique DNA, a Y chromosome, and so forth, that if you say, well, it started out as a non-human entity, but then by the time it got to 16 weeks, 18 weeks, 2 months, whatever, then it became human, and that's when he became God. that's actually just another form of the adoptionist heresy. So when we talk about this, now again, I'm getting away from the secular, more into the spiritual. And why I say,
It's a super long after party too.
yeah, this has a lot of ramifications for those of us who are Christians who believe in the incarnation and the resurrection that takes the body and the physical elements of humanity very seriously. And so because of this, maybe I'll use this as a springboard, because I do think that there are answers that we can talk about. Regarding, what do you do in those difficult situations? And yeah, I do think that the church and individual Christians have a role to play in helping individuals who find themselves, in really difficult circumstances. But what I don't want to do is what we celebrate, we encourage. So if we celebrate circumstances that lead to the likelihood of abortion, whatever those circumstances may be, and like I said, I think they go back further, including largely
that
with
seems
men.
to be sort of the consensus here, that there are some roots that we need to deal with. So no woman ever has to be faced with this choice.
Right. And again, like I said, if we take out the 2% and so forth,
a lot of it can, if we deal with men, would take care of some of it.
correct. And that's where too, it's looking at what is in the best interest, not just of the individual, but what's in the best interest of society. What's in the best interest of the unborn, and so forth. Those are things that hopefully we can be able to wrap our brains around. Yeah. We have gone way into overtime, which makes sense, given the
I
the
have
topic.
Loved you guys interacting, and we've just begun the conversation. I think that we'll have to revisit this. I don't know if we'll do it in a secret church environment. We'll just do it like more live stream, but I think it's worthy to keep talking about for sure.
Correct. And like I said, I will do my best. I hope, please, and you can reach out to me privately if you want to. I hope I've been able to present this in a way that didn't come across bashing of anyone, but also at the same time that doesn't apologize for, taking a principled pastoral position, which I would hope that you wouldn't respect me if I failed to.
Or insensitive to those
Right.
that find themselves in this situation.
Like I said, I think back of my friends, including the one who was raped and so forth, and it's like, like you said, it's not so easy to just flippantly go, oh, well, no. And I'm not suggesting that. I do think that, compassion, Christ-like compassion. Remember the woman caught in adultery, he said, neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more. There is that Christ-likeness that we have to carry into our conversations and discussions. Now, that's dealing with it on a micro level. The macro level, which is the law of the land or the law of our state, is something altogether different. Now, because of that, do I think on the macro level last week was good in terms of good law? Yeah, I think it was. And I know I'm not alone. I think that there are individuals across the political spectrum that would agree with me there, even if they don't like the implications or the result or the motives of those who were advocating for it. And so that's where, hopefully as we go forth in this conversation, because it ain't going away, okay? And that we can hopefully, like what Jeremy said, and my desire in bringing it up, is hopefully to be able to build bridges without baiting and switching. Okay, to be able to say, okay, let's look at this, and without condemning individuals who maybe made decisions that we would disagree with, or maybe they were scared, they didn't know, they're just doing at the time or whatever. The point is not to bash anybody, but to say, okay, going forward, what is the best perspective from those of us if we look at it theologically, philosophically, legally, scientifically, and like I said, hopefully we can get into that a little bit more maybe next week.
We'll see. Maybe next week, maybe a secret church. I feel like you're going to need a lot of time.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Perhaps. Dudley said the moral right to self-determination is only granted to those who are legally considered adults, assuming that they're even mentally deemed capable. In some cases, even adults don't. It's a two-edged sword. There's a time when young black women were legally sterilized, the moral issue of abortion cannot be decided on legality alone. I agree, which is why I said, even when it comes to states that allow it, as a quote-unquote, pro-life pastor, I don't think that California's position will be moral, and it's something that I would personally hope would be reversed. But that's, again, a discussion for another time. Jeremy said, thank you for taking the time to spitball. It was a lot of spitballing. I agree with needing to establish ground rules for our conversations about this topic. It's hard to build bridges when both sides are unwilling to seek unity. Myrna said, I think you may want to consider doing another discussion on this topic to help educate and put things into perspective.
No, I think so. And I really love the conversation. I love,
I appreciate
I love the honesty
the
and
kindness that we're all able to talk with.
And both Dudley and Crystal bringing up, here's certain scenarios, here's the emotional aspect. These are real people that we're talking about that are going to be impacted by this decision. And it's not, we have to have compassion in discussing it. Doesn't mean we have to change our values or change, what we theologically believe about something. We do need to be compassionate about it.
Well, we do.
And we do need to wrestle with it and talk about it.
We do need to change if we're wrong.
Oh, absolutely.
And that includes me.
Yeah, of course.
Bottom line is, like I said, we're going to look at...
I'm just saying being compassionate towards somebody doesn't mean you're not being true to what you believe about something. And correct. I think too many people who are pro-life are super ugly towards people who have a difference of opinion or have personally had abortions. And I just think that's where the church has gone really wrong.
On a micro level, I think I could agree with that. On a macro level, I would say this to my friends and family that are pro-choice. Be a good time to police their own side, because that's who's, rioting in the streets and advocating violence and assassination and so forth. And I think if you find yourself sort of simpatico with that behavior, that does not comport or align with biblical Christianity.
Or like the video you showed me last night of some woman literally having a tantrum in her house because Roe v. Wade had been overturned. But I think it goes back to a lot of people not understanding what this means. It doesn't mean that abortion's been done away with. But we all have morals and morality, but we also should take those morals into our voting booth and
I'll
that's a whole nother discussion.
Yeah, I'll tie it in with this. Objective morality only makes sense if God is real.
That's right.
Otherwise, everybody just has their own opinion, and we're all just dancing to our DNA, like Richard Dawkins said. And when it comes to objective morality, that's the difference between my morality, your morality, somebody else's morality. As Christians, we need to seek objective morality as far as, okay, God, what is your position on this? Because ultimately, objective moral values come from God.
That's right.
And so the moment I personalize them, or relativize them, wherever my morals do not align with God's objective moral values, the responsibility is for me to align with God, not for him to just say, okay, whatever, manly, knock yourself out.
Crystal, I agree 100% with you on the anger, that both sides are demonstrating plenty of that right now, which is why, I'm glad that we could have the discussion here, because I know not everybody has the same perspective or same belief on this, but that we could have it civilly, and that the desire, as Jeremy articulated...
We're in coastal California.
As Jeremy... I feel like Jeremy articulated...
Lots of bridges to build.
That Jeremy articulated for most of us here is, I would say all of us probably, where are the places that we can build the bridges? Because I think that is the desire of the Monarchs community, is to ask the question of what does love require of me, and where can I lead God's ways with compassion, and what are God's ways, wrestling with that and knowing what those answers are, going back to the objective morality. So thank you all for a civil discussion, an honest discussion. I so appreciate you being willing to put your thoughts in there, not to fear, asking questions. And even the ones that there's no dumb questions. So thank you all for that. It really helps. I agree. Information helps build bridges.
Which means I'll probably have some more information for us to discuss
That's
next
right.
time. But after this elongated after party,
And we do not have summer hours so that we can just go on and on and on.
No.
This was a unique one in response.
it's
to
unique in
Randy.
American history.
Yeah,
I mean,
it deserves all the time.
I'm a history nerd. This is we're talking about American history right now.
Yeah, exactly. All right, everyone. Have a great Sunday afternoon. Enjoy your families. We will see you around online, and we will definitely be back for more discussion on this.
Let's go spread more light than heat.
That's right. Have a good day.